The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 576, Internal and External Troubles. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. The flowers are still blooming, but with some cold resistant varieties. But Franz felt something unusual, and he was afraid that the coming days would not be easy. While Western Europe was hit by blizzards, Central Europe experienced a mild winter. It seemed that there had been no snow in Netherlands all winter, and there might be another drought next year, but in fact, Franz was overly worried. The Austrian Empire's agriculture would only experience poor harvests after 1846, but it was still much better than its neighbors. France would have 3 consecutive years of poor harvests in 1845, 1846, and 1847, which led to a sharp decline in the purchasing power of French farmers. At the same time, financial defaults increased significantly, land annexation accelerated, and ultimately triggered the revolution. As for how bad things will be in Spain, Franz is not sure, but he will not jump out of the routine of famine, riots, and civil war at the same time. Franz also planned to increase the area of food cultivation in the colony. Although doing so would sacrifice some economic benefits, it would add insurance for the future. In fact, such behavior will not lead to a reduction in production, but a relative slowdown in growth. In addition, Franz also needs to establish some more food reserve bases. After all, with his brain circuit, uprisings and riots always seem to be related to not having enough to eat and not being able to survive. Franz was thinking that if he could feed most people, would he be able to eliminate the rebellion in some areas? Or should we only allow rebellion to appear in some areas and then use all our strength to completely eliminate it? But a sudden riot poured cold water on Franz. Northern Italy, Milan. Italian nationalists launched a riot in this city, the heart of the Austrian Empire, and naturally ended in failure. Historically, there were constant small-scale riots in northern Italy under the rule of the Austrian Empire, and there are even no accurate records about them. However, this time the scale was very large. The insurrectionists had a large number of weapons. They first attacked the police station, and then coerced the people to try to rob the arsenal. Fortunately, Marshal Radetzky did not adopt a soft policy this time and directly mobilized 3 regiments of troops to suppress the attack. When the crowd saw the troops in full formation, they began to retreat. The insurrectionists who coerced the people knew that they would completely lose their chance when the crowd dispersed. So someone detonated the explosives that had been prepared in the crowd and then opened fire on the crowd. The Austrians fight them now. Come on. Fortunately, Marshal Radetzky's soldiers were disciplined enough and did not fire indiscriminately due to excessive nervousness, otherwise it would have been a real massacre. The people fled in panic, but since the Austrian army did not fire, and the black missiles and neat cues were also intimidating, naturally no one would rush towards the Austrian army's formation desperately. Soon only the die-hard insurgents were left. Instead of retreating, they chose to shoot at the Austrian troops and throw homemade explosives. However, this kind of chaotic attack was not a threat to the troops, who were ready for battle. As the neat gunfire sounded, the first insurgents who rushed up were wiped out, followed by continuous gunfire. The sound is like fried beans. The insurgents were completely suppressed, and the lines began to move forward. Those who had never experienced war were frightened by this sense of oppression and could only run as fast as they could. However, elite hunters had already gone around and cut off their retreat. At the same time, they also occupied commanding heights everywhere, and a precise hunting began. Later, the existence of the remnants of the rebels was learned through the captured insurgents, and nearly 1,300 people were finally arrested. Added to the total number of people killed and captured before, the total number reached an astonishing 2,500 people. Although it is not as high as the number of the Papal Palace rebels, who often numbered in the tens of thousands, the northern Italian region controlled by the Austrian Empire has not had a riot of more than 100 people for several years, since the Carbonari uprising. After all, when you have money to make and food to eat, who wants to risk your life? Moreover, Due to the emperor's imperial edict, evil people must not be tolerated, and good people must not be wronged. Coupled with Franz's continued attention, the security in northern Italy is relatively good. On the other hand, armed fights involving hundreds of people often broke out in Italy due to things like grabbing business or gangs grabbing territory. However, because the Austrian Empire collected a large number of weapons, there were not many casualties. The local magistrates just said that this was a national tradition and did not interfere too much. After investigation, most of these insurgents were dock workers, traditional craftsmen and small businessmen. They each have their own reasons, although on the surface they say they want to overthrow the monarchy and resist foreign humiliation. But in fact, they are all based on their own interests. Due to the arrival of a large number of immigrants, the wages of dock workers have been suppressed again and again. Although Italy's economy has taken off, their wages have continued to decline. At the same time, the officials of the Austrian Empire had no intention of stopping these foreign populations. After all, in their view, this was a problem between brothers and the border is so big that they can't manage it. What's more, the Austrian Empire is traditionally a multi-ethnic country and has never said that people from the country are not allowed to enter. Some officials were even foreign immigrants who migrated from South Germany or North Germany. Austria's industrialization will inevitably have an impact on handicraftsmen, especially the emergence of large-scale factories, which directly eliminates the survival soil of many traditional handicrafts. As for the small businessmen, they have also been severely affected, because the development of industrialization will inevitably tilt financial policies towards the big businessmen. This has led to the rapid expansion of capital, with the strong getting stronger and the weak getting weaker. While the big businessmen were praising the policies of the Austrian Empire, the small businessmen were struggling for shrinking assets and squeezed living space. In fact, big businessmen will not give up on certain industries because of low profits. On the contrary, they plan to take them all. In order to complete the monopoly, those small businessmen need to be squeezed out. So they frantically raise the threshold, while frantically lowering prices. Although the people feel benefits in the short term, in the long term the results of monopoly are likely to harm the interests of the people and upstream and downstream industries, and may even harm the country. But now it seems that we don't have to wait long before these people can stand up and endanger the interests of the Austrian Empire. This uprising sounded the alarm for Franz. It seemed that things would not be as smooth sailing as he thought. At the same time, such a large-scale uprising also has these weapons and intelligence. Franz didn't believe that it was all organized voluntarily by the local people, and there was most likely a black hand behind the scenes, and this black hand may be the United Kingdom, France, or even Sardinia or Switzerland, or all of them. Chapter 577 Immigration, Where to Run. Just after Christmas, the Austrian Imperial Navy intercepted 2 stowaway ships heading to the United States. That's right. At this time, the Austrian Empire had legislated to prohibit any organization or individual from traveling to the New World without official permission. Violators would be subject to heavy fines and exile from the colonies. The reason is very simple. That is, the Austrian Empire is deeply suspicious of the United States, a country where slavery exists, especially the previous case of a slave trader kidnapping a royal archduke, which made it hate human smuggling. In order to prevent citizens of the Austrian Empire from being persecuted, the benevolent imperial government decided to severely punish human smuggling. Of course, the empire will not restrict personal freedom. All routes to the New World are contracted by the imperial government. As for the price, because there are necessary security measures such as escort fleets, the cost will be slightly higher and a little bit. In addition, the Austrian Empire also proposed a bill to combat human smuggling at the German Confederation Congress. The German states have long been dissatisfied with the loss of population. As a result, all German states tacitly voted unanimously to pass the German Confederation Security Law to severely crack down on smuggling and human trafficking. In fact, the German region was the main force of population immigration in this era. Britain, France, and Portugal had long been aware of the importance of immigration, but the populations of these 3 countries were not enough to colonize the territories they occupied. So an alternative plan came out, which was to use cheap Germans and Italians. However, Compared to the Italians who loved their families and stayed together, the Germans were obviously easier to control and worked harder. They mainly used the social circles of this era to attract some Germans who had a good impression of Britain, France, and Portugal. However, as time went by, the colony's need for population and craftsmen became more and more urgent, and the French even directly crossed the Rhine and Saar rivers to promote their colonial policy to the locals. The Germans who immigrated to North Africa could get Algerian land and women, and they did not need to join the French army, as long as they paid taxes like the French. The British South Australia Company even offered free transportation, food and lodging. You must know that it is a journey of half the world from the German region to South Australia. Due to the favourable conditions, South Australian companies attract a large number of immigrants, and the value created by the new immigrants in the local area far exceeds the cost. So New Zealand companies began to follow suit and offered more favourable conditions. The last two British companies even went so far as to smear each other in the race for German immigrants. Australia says New Zealand is full of cannibals, and the latter says the former is a penal colony for prisoners. In addition to the large companies of these great powers, Brazil, La Plata, Argentina, the Central American Federation, South Africa, and even Muhammad Ali of Egypt have participated in this feast of dividing the population. At first, Muhammad Ali's request for the Germans to convert to Christianity was met with strong resistance. After the defeat, he learned from the experience and relaxed religious restrictions. However, another defeat caused Egypt to completely decline. The Americans signed agreements with some small countries to corrupt the upper level officials and forced those skilled craftsmen and scholars to migrate to the New World so they could receive generous rewards. They even established the Mainz Noble Association to specifically identify some scholars and craftsmen with liberal tendencies to send to the New World. This way they could eliminate domestic hidden dangers and get a good intermediary fee. The same organization also appeared in Hamburg, Augsburg, Hesse, Bremen and other places. However, at this time, these people were all labeled by the Austrian Empire as persecuting their compatriots and human trafficking. In addition, those in the German region, the wave of nationalism is so miserable, let alone death. Historically, Belgium has signed an immigration agreement with Guatemala, and they will introduce 10,000 immigrants to the latter within 3 years. The Belgians chose the Germans. In 3 years, more than 8,000 German families came to this legendary promised land on Belgian ships. However, when the 3-year period came, only more than 300 people survived in the end. They lived in shabby wooden houses and thatched huts. They had to worry about not having enough food to fill their stomachs and being whipped by supervisors, but they also had to fear the harassment from the indigenous people. These people have degenerated into a group of livestock that can be driven around by others. But now the Belgian coastline and the Guatemalan government have been destroyed by France, so this tragedy no longer exists. The 2 small cargo ships intercepted by the Austrian Navy contained a full 1,400 Germans and Italians. In fact, such small ships could only hold 200 people at most, but they crammed in 3 times the number. You can imagine how dark the hearts of these smugglers are. At the same time, in order to avoid pursuit by the German Confederation, they will hide stowaways below the deck. Although France developed air conditioners and refrigerators, they were not affordable for ordinary people, let alone these stowaways. Hundreds of people were crowded into a small space, and their heavy breathing caused a layer of water mist to condense on the lower deck, making the cabin feel like a steamer. Their lives are worse than those of the former black slaves. At the same time, with the advancement of science, the people under the smugglers know the importance of cleanliness. In order to prevent the cargoes from getting sick, they will occasionally sprinkle quicklime on them. The food and sanitary conditions were indescribably disgusting. Fortunately, due to the advancement of technology, the sailing time of the same voyage was greatly shortened, but it was still an arduous journey. Sir, they are all voluntary. We have the contract as proof. The leader of the smuggler shouted as he saw the hatch cover of the deck being opened. Friedrich watched the stowaways being pulled out of the small and cramped space one by one. Although those people had just been at sea for a few days, they felt uncomfortable being packed in a can like sardines. Some people began to vomit. Friedrich withdrew his gaze and kicked the snakehead in the face. Isn't it easy to force these half-dead people to sign a contract? You damn human traffickers. At This time, a woman shouted, "We are all voluntary. We just want to pursue a better life." The woman's figure is not bad, but her hair is unkempt and her body smells disgusting. Is this what you call a good life? But no matter what, you should be punished if you break the law. The Navy sailors stuffed the unkempt woman back into the cabin without hesitation, along with the smugglers and human traffickers, and the remaining people were also classified into voluntary immigrants and coerced immigrants. Those who are coerced and have the ability to survive will be repatriated to their respective hometowns, and those who want to stay in Austria or are unable to survive on their own will also be dealt with by specialized officials. As for those volunteers, they will not be pulled back to the port, but sent directly to the Austrian colonies, which can be regarded as fulfilling their wishes. The smuggler and his associates will be put on public trial, but not before they are pulled into a small dark room by the secret police and tortured intensively. Although the evidence obtained during the torture was outrageous, the Imperial government had the power to speak and could not quibble. And people were often more willing to believe what they wanted to believe. Chapter 578. Take it from the people and use it for the people. The scandal that occurred in Milan made the top leaders of Vienna very angry. Such a large-scale riot, with such a large number of casualties, and occurring in a core city, had only happened in Hungary before. However, they seemed to only intend to deal with the local officials and garrison, feeling that this was caused by the incompetence of the officials and the negligence of the garrison. But Franz's view is just the opposite. Both local officials and the garrison are very capable. After all, a riot of this scale will turn into a massacre if not careful, just like the French in Lyon and Alsace-Lorraine. I'm like that. The great powers can make a big fuss about this, and even secondary powers like the Kingdom of Sardinia are not considered effective. As long as they have enough strength, they can also propose to the Austrian Empire to let Lombardy become independent. Milan belongs to the Lombardy region, although it sounds like a joke now. Historically it was this small country with an area less than 1/8 of France that unified Italy and eventually expelled the forces of Austria and France. In fact, riots/uprisings often occurred in Europe in this era, and due to technical limitations, not many of them could be detected and stopped in advance. Whether it was the workers' uprising in Britain, the assassinations of political figures and celebrities by radicals, or several large-scale uprisings in France, workers' strike in Lyon, peasant tax uprising in Provence, the Silesian uprising in Prussia, the Polish uprising in Russia, or even it was a Decembrist coup. The actual results of the above are much worse than what happened in Milan, so Franz felt that local officials and the army should be rewarded. Franz knew very well how difficult it was for those Italian officials to serve. They were constrained by local forces all day long, and there were not many capable people under his command. Although he had the emperor's decree as a guarantee, the most he could do was to hit the obvious places. They are just separatist forces, local overlords, but in fact, local businessmen, churches, and gangs have long formed an interest group, and under the banner of tradition and religion, they coerce people and corrupt and morally kidnap officials. This is one of the main reasons why local people cannot serve as the highest administrative and military governors. As for the military, this kind of extremely restrained security warfare often causes huge losses, and at the same time, causes great psychological pressure on the soldiers. Long-term depression can even drive ordinary people crazy. As a high-risk profession as a soldier, and with little social status at the time, it is difficult to say what these people will do in the future. Franz did not intend to let this group of people shed blood and tears, and even die without money, and no way to rest in peace. However, the national system cannot be changed arbitrarily, and naturally it cannot start from wages and pensions, so it can only appear in the form of awards. Otherwise it will only arouse a jealousy of the armies in other regions. Of course, Franz was not prepared to pay for this money alone, so he applied for this job from the Imperial government. In fact, Lombardy was nominally the territory of Archduke Franz Karol. As the eldest son of the former, it was understandable that Franz Joseph went to inspect the people's situation and express condolences to the army. The higher-ups of the empire were a little uneasy, because there had just been an uprising in the area and Franz might be in danger, which would be a heavy blow to both the royal family and the empire. Franz didn't think so. If those royal guards were really that weak, then he might die, even if he stayed in the palace. Look at the Archduchess Louise of Parma, who goes against the grain all day long and offends the most radical people in France, but she still raises a group of young people and lives a luxurious and corrupt life. Franz sympathized with the aunt's plight, but did not agree with her actions. But Franz doesn't plan to go to Parma this time. He just wants to solve what happened in Milan. Because Franz's attitude was very resolute, the empire had no choice but to agree. Both the imperial government and Mrs. Sophie felt that Franz needed a guardian. Franz Joseph then boarded the train to Milan with his father, Archduke Franz Karol. Franz was so confused by this operation that he didn't know who would be watching whom next. Franz even suspected that Mrs. Sophie was planning something, but the latter denied it and said that she just hoped that the former and his father would strengthen their relationship. The train was a bit boring. There were more than 1,000 people on the train. All of them were guards and servants. The railway company even made temporary modifications to accommodate the two royal princes. A giant bulletproof glass window was installed in the middle car, allowing a clear view of the scenery outside the window. Archduke Franz Karol shouted with excitement as he watched the scenery passing by outside the window. "Look, Franz. The tree moves. Father, it's the train that's moving. Look, Franz. The bird is flying backwards. Father, we are the ones moving forward. Wow. 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 It's so fast. It's more fun than riding a horse. Father, you might consider sitting down for a drink and then some sleep. We're here." "Nice. Offer a shot of tequila." Ajani immediately stepped forward and filled a glass for Archduke Franz Karol. "Please. Enjoy. Thank you." Usually, his chamberlain or his own servant poured wine for him. Archduke Franz Karol was still not used to it, so he instinctively looked at it twice before saying to his son, "Franz, won't you have a drink?" Ajani, a good-hearted person, immediately picked up the bottle, and Franz quickly held down the glass. "I'd like some juice, please." Ajani glanced at Kagura, who immediately lowered her head and walked backwards. "When will you grow up like this?" Archduke Franz Karol said meaningfully. "Father, increasing age has nothing to do with whether you drink alcohol. Why doesn't it matter? Age is only a function of the passage of time. Then why does time pass? Because that is an objective law." "What are the objective laws?" Franz held his forehead and did not want to continue with this endless question. "Father, you drink too much." "I don't have much. Drunk people are like this." "Okay, then I'm going to have a rest. You can eat and drink well." The Lombard government held a grand welcome ceremony at the station, after which the two royal princes were arranged into a palace of the Habsburg family. Then there was the overwhelming gift list and boxes of gifts. After all, they are members of the royal family, especially since the father and son are the first and second heirs to the throne. In fact, the nobles and businessmen in these places usually have no chance to give gifts to the father and son, and usually those things will not be accepted. This time, these people were surprised because the two grand dukes accepted everything. But think about it, after all, the father and son in the legend are not normal. Ajani actually didn't understand. After all, the gifts given by these gentry in Lombardy were too shabby compared to the gifts she received in Vienna. And no matter how generous the gift is, Franz rarely accepts it. Faced with Ajani's questions, Franz's answer was, "Take it from the people. You sit for the people." Chapter 579 Dinner. I'm not in a good mood. The two chapters have been merged into one. The gentry in the city of Milan and even the entire Lombardy region were excited. After all, under the Austrian Empire's official system, being able to become familiar with the royal family was really something worth celebrating. At the same time, they also breathed a sigh of relief. After all, what happened in Milan far exceeded their previous expectations. You must know that a few years ago, despite being betrayed by a traitor, the Carbonari rebel army with less than 1,000 people could still deal with the two brigades of the Austrian Empire for nearly half a month. The infantry regiments of the Austrian Empire were large regiments, usually consisting of 2,500 to 3,000 soldiers. A brigade usually consists of 2 regiments, as well as a number of directly subordinate units. Therefore, the size of the suppressive force at that time exceeded 10,000. The real planners believed that this riot would last for a long time, at least until the great powers intervened or retreated. This group of people obviously had no idea at all. In other countries, the Austrians might not dare to fight. General Leakey, who used money to buy entertainment, could not be compared with the veteran Marshal Radetzky. And to say the least, Milan is the core of the Austrian Empire's rule in northern Italy. No matter how many rebels there are, it is impossible to ignore it, unless the empire center is paralyzed. The local gentry in Lombardy still hope that someone will make a fuss. After all, with Hungary as a role model, it would be great to not pay taxes and have political and military control. But before that, they need to squeeze out external officials. So Franz received a lot of dirty information from officials, local outsiders, and even from the army and the Duchess of Parma, who didn't want to care about anything and didn't care about anything. Gianni smiled while watching. She seemed to have found the fun she had not seen for a long time. Franz, is this what you call well done? They form cliques and attack each other. They don't look like they are a group at all. Franz shook his head helplessly and smiled. It would be really troublesome if they were all monolithic. Gianni thought so, but then asked, but wouldn't it be impossible for them to restrain each other like this? Franz, it is true to contain each other, but not everything is achieved. Northern Italy has always been an important source of tax revenue for the empire. Its economic growth rate is also the fastest except for Bohemia, and the railway network is basically completed. Gianni asked with some confusion, why is this? Mutual supervision can curb corruption to a certain extent, and mutual competition can improve efficiency. Of course, if mutual opposition lasts for a long time, trouble will occur, just like now. Although the two sides have deep grievances, the improvement of welfare benefits and economic development in the Austrian Empire have covered up this contradiction to a certain extent. It's just that there are external powers infiltrating and deceiving, and the remnants of the Carbonari party have been working on something to revitalize Italy. It's really funny. Italy never existed. It was Rome that once ruled the Apennines. The Habsburg family once had a crown of Emperor of the Romans. If you want it now, just go to the Pope and buy another one. I believe that Gregory XVI would be happy to accept this deal. After hearing this, Gianni left thoughtfully. She went to complete the work that Franz had given her before and convert these gifts into money. After Gregory XVI came to power, he devoted himself to amassing money and at the same time was extremely opposed to the Italian national movement. At this time, the Pope was suppressing the uprising. Dozens of uprisings broke out in the Papal States from 1841 to 1845, with various banners, including national independence, tax resistance, and opposition to religious laws. Pope Gregory XVI carried out large-scale capitalist economic activities in the papacy and successively established financial institutions such as the Discount Bank, the Bank of Rome, the Holy Spirit Bank, and the Savings Bank. He also established a holy water company, sold indulgences, and at the same time, used his power to suppress persecuting competitors. Franz's previous letter asking for help, written by Emperor Yangli of the Ming Dynasty to the Holy See, was bought from this old magician. At the evening banquet, celebrities from Milan, as well as the governor and senior officials of the Lombardy region, were all present. The decoration of the venue was extremely luxurious, with giant crystal chandeliers illuminating the hall, as if it were daytime. All kinds of delicacies and fine wines were placed on the table, and the ladies and beauties were already waiting eagerly for it. At this moment the waiter suddenly cleared his throat and the band played solemn music. Archduke Franz Karol has arrived. Archduke Franz Joseph has arrived. The door slowly opened, and everyone held their breath. At this time, the two archdukes entered wearing the iconic white military uniforms of the Austrian Empire. It's just that Archduke Franz Karol seemed to have something under his arm. The waiter was confused after taking a look at it. Then the former seemed to suddenly remember something and handed a seal to the latter. A seal weighing more than 60 kilograms instantly overwhelmed the waiter. After all, it was much heavier than a cape and hat. Then the little hairy fish bounced away. Then the father and son walked straight to the center of the venue under the astonished eyes of everyone. Franz Joseph poured a glass of wine and handed it to his father, then poured himself a glass of juice, raised the glass and said, "To the Empire." At this time, people recovered from the shocking appearance of Archduke Franz Karol depositing seals, and they all raised their glasses to the Empire. Then came the long reception time, when Franz and his father had to accept the respect and greetings of others with high intensity. After finally getting to the dinner table, Franz had to give a toast as usual. After all, his father was really not very good at this, but this time, everyone was shocked again. After all, most people thought that the IQs of the two Grand Dukes might be about the same point. Although the Habsburg royal family tried their best to package Franz, their propaganda methods were obviously problematic. They were too fake and exaggerated, and in the end no one believed him. In fact, before the banquet started, someone even set up a bet on whether the two Grand Dukes could finish a complete sentence. Although Franz is only 14 years old, his height is the same as that of an adult, but his face is still a little childish. However, the hard and shiny chestnut short hair, the cold white skin, the dark blue eyes, and the noble temperament cultivated since childhood are all stunning. But Franz himself hated carrying it like this. After all, it was very troublesome and tiring. Then there was a group of noble ladies and daughters who happened to pass by Franz in a group. According to traditional etiquette, at a banquet, the person in superior position does not speak, and the person in lower position is not allowed to take the initiative to strike up a conversation. Compared with the son who is watertight, the father who goes to the dinner with a seal under his arm is much easier to deal with. After all, the latter likes to drink, but fortunately Franz has already passed the gas beforehand. Grand Duke, the people of Milan are taking desperate risks because they can't survive. And those outsiders, they are really hateful. They not only took away the jobs of the locals, but also seriously disrupted our public security environment. Those Sicilians are all gangsters, thieves, and liars. I really hope the Imperial government can find a way to punish them as they deserve. The speaker is an old man with a pale face and heavy wrinkles. He likes to show his yellow gold teeth when he rubs his hands. He is Vera Riva, the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Milan. What he said was not a lie. The arrival of a large number of immigrants did affect the local order, but what he said was not entirely out of justice. In fact, outsiders have formed their own forces, are unwilling to pay membership fees, and compete with them for the market. And government officials don't care about competition among themselves. As long as someone pays taxes, that's enough. The so-called president of the Milan Chamber of Commerce was a tax collector in the past. What he does is contract taxes and then earn the difference between the country and the people. However, with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the era of tax collectors also ended. Nowadays, taxes are collected directly by the government, but the president of the Chamber of Commerce still has a strong influence in the local area, and he also has a title in the Austrian Empire, which provides the possibility of tax avoidance. The situation in the Austrian Empire at that time was very special. The nobles traditionally had the right not to pay taxes. However, due to the reforms of Joseph II, the nobles were also included in the ranks of taxpayers. Then the nobles united to overthrow the emperor and his reforms. What is interesting is that in the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, the Austrian nobility was completely defeated, and then the most conservative Emperor Francis II resumed the most radical reforms of his uncle. However, due to a lot of historical issues, some nobles do have the right to reduce taxes. For example, the royal family and Hungarian nobles have tax-free privileges. In Metellinia and northern Italy, even Prince Metternich must pay taxes, but those with titles above Baron have a certain amount of exemptions. In fact, the vast majority of Austrian nobles have no titles and only have an honorary title. These people do not have the privilege of tax reduction or exemption. The previous president of the Milan Chamber of Commerce used his family's title to help people avoid taxes. The specific process was similar to the donation in the Ming dynasty. The Austrian Empire explicitly prohibited such tax evasion, but the rules were destined to provide huge benefits to violators from the moment they were formulated. At this time, someone must have asked, if tax can be avoided, why would those foreign businessmen disagree? We are all Italians. Can we cooperate and win-win to cheat Austria together? But this approach is too risky for outsiders, and Mr. Ivor has a really bad reputation. He often embezzles other people's property without any reason, using many excuses ranging from breach of contract to spitting point. However, the reality is that the more Ivor eats, the more people are afraid of him, and his title changes from vampire to sir. Over time, he becomes a local tyrant point, until Austria established the Apennine Customs Union. A large number of foreign people poured into northern Italy. Among these people were not only laborers, but also many businessmen and craftsmen, as well as politically persecuted exiles. The majority of them are from the Sicilian people, which is mainly due to the liberal reforms of Ferdinand II. What this king wanted was to develop the economy and the military. However, the first thing people wanted to do was to revolutionize his life point. As a result, this enlightened liberal became the most cruel and staunch conservative. Then as the economy of northern Italy boomed, a large number of southern Italians went there to make a living point, and in fact, the atmosphere in northern Italy is relatively open, and ideological control is relatively loose. The Austrians here prefer to make money rather than stabilize their rule. The main reason is that the country was too poor after the Napoleonic Wars. The famous Four Corners fortress, it's all because of its long-term disrepair, and its defense power has been greatly reduced. Point back to the main story. These outsiders have money and technology, coupled with Austria's good policies, and the two trends of opening up trade routes and colonial development. They have the momentum to catch up as latecomers. As a result, those local snakes got upset and started causing trouble. However, by chance, this group of people beat up Marshal Radetzky's eldest son, and by chance, they attracted the attention of Vienna. Point as a result, a decree that evil people must not be tolerated, and good people must not be wronged wiped out the largest local gangster, Mer Gabriel Cassati, Father Leonardo, the Dean of Delmanda, and there are a lot of local gentry who are implicated. Point the so-called strong dragon does not suppress the local snake. That is because a snake does not take the initiative to provoke the dragon. Otherwise it will be nothing more than a ball of rotten meat. Point Franz had investigated before coming, and this Vera Riva was one of the biggest suspects in planning the riot. Point at this time, a young man with a firm face and a straight body rebuked loudly, "You are talking nonsense." Then, as expected, he was pushed to the ground by two guards in the crowd before the ladies had time to scream. Point however, his voice still startled Archduke Franz Karol, and threw a glass of wine on Vera Riva's face. Point the latter glared subconsciously, and then returned to his original state, but he could not escape the eyes of the attendant at the side. Point the hawk-like gaze on Ivor's face made him feel cold all over, and then several guards surrounded him and checked him over while helping him clean up the wine stains. The leading guard shook his head slightly, and then Franz Karol's attendant, Kalga Willi, withdrew his gaze. Point the young man who was pinned to the ground struggled and shouted, "Grand Duke," he lied. "We have always paid taxes in accordance with the law. It is Ivor, the vampire. It is him. Drink. Drink." The young man was interrupted by Archduke Franz Karol before he finished speaking. Point when everyone was puzzled. After all, everyone was waiting to see the show. Archduke Franz Karol shouted loudly, "I have an announcement." For a moment, no one knew whether the Grand Duke drank too much or was really ill. However, they did not dare to speak due to his identity, so the atmosphere was controlled. The Empire will not treat its own people badly. It will provide work in exchange for relief. Everyone was a little confused. Fortunately, some people noticed the keyword relief for work. Someone said with some confusion, "Work for relief. Lombardy has been doing well in recent years, and there have been no disasters." It was time for Franz to appear. He cleared his throat and said, "The Empire has investigated the situation in northern Italy and found that the fundamental problem causing social unrest is caused by the lack of jobs. Therefore, the Imperial family has decided to implement work for relief in northern Italy. I hope everyone can unite and work together for the common good. Strive for a better future. Food for work is good news." After all, no matter what major projects the imperial government carries out locally, it will attract a large number of laborers. This can indeed alleviate the competitive pressure brought by the migrant population to a certain extent, and at the same time, increase employment and promote consumption, thus creating more business opportunities in the process of this virtuous cycle. If the local area can restore its own hematopoietic function, it will truly eliminate the crisis caused by the foreign population. It's just that the country will be in debt because of this, but what does that have to do with them? So people started partying all night, and the young people from before were let go. Archduke Franz Karol walked up to the young man and handed him a glass of wine. This moved the latter to tears. After all, he had been away from his hometown for so many years, and was overwhelmed by excessive pressure. The former didn't quite understand and just said, "Have a drink. If you have a drink, you won't feel sad." The next day, when people asked how to provide relief through work, Archduke Franz Karol replied, "Tear down the wall." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 580, Tearing Down the Wall. Milan's old city wall, full of traces of time, is full of thickness and once played the role of a safety protector for city residents. However, with the rapid development of weapons and equipment, its role is becoming more and more limited, and instead it hinders the further development of the city. After all, the city wall was originally built to deal with barbarian invasions in the early Middle Ages, but it couldn't even defend against slings, let alone modern artillery. Moreover, its defensive capabilities will only weaken over time in the future, and even large bastions like Vienna and Paris have withdrawn from the stage of history. Of course, saying this does not mean that the city wall is useless. At least the ordinary people living there do not think so. Once this inertial reliance on luck is not eliminated, it can provide an effective reassurance that the defending side will rely on the city to defend and refuse to surrender. Once the attacker starts to attack a city, it usually means a massacre. At least for the residents in the city, a catastrophe is inevitable. In view of the possibility of falling into such a possible dilemma in the future, Franz felt that the development of so many years cannot be destroyed in one day, so demolishing the city walls and widening the roads is the right way. After all, the thought of street battles and other situations is disturbing. I have a terrible headache. Not only Milan, but also the traditional big cities in the entire empire had this common problem, so he planned to carry out a comprehensive transformation. However, there are still 3 years until the legendary Spring of all nations, and there is still plenty of time, so there is no need to be too anxious for the time being. In addition, while the demolition work is progressing, some important fortresses still need to be repaired, such as the Four Corners fortresses in northern Italy, Verona, Mantua, Peschiera and Lignago, and others. New fortresses and strongholds, as well as storehouses, were also required in strategically important locations. After the plan to demolish the wall and build the fortress was announced, wealthy gentry from all walks of life in northern Italy came over with great interest to offer suggestions and plan to get a piece of the pie. For this reason, the enlightened Archduke Franz announced a 5-year plan deadline to these people on the spot. The demolition and construction plan would be completed within 5 years. As for wages, the imperial government in Vienna will settle the payment in one lump sum after the expiration of the period. As for whether this group of people will still be there 5 years from now, there is no way of knowing. In addition, he did not forget the matter of comforting the troops, but the total money sent from all walks of life in Milan only amounted to more than 200,000 florins. It seems that he really thought he was a fool. Fortunately, he originally planned to help these people. But this is no longer important. Franz still distributed rewards to all soldiers who participated in the suppression operations as planned. Among them, the soldiers will receive rewards equivalent to 20 months' salary. The officer's salary was roughly 10 months' salary, doubled for the wounded, and doubled for the killed. In the end, Franz scattered a total of 2.3 million florins. Franz had two main purposes for doing this. One was to tell the old marshal and his troops that they had done nothing wrong. If they continue to work hard next time, they need to treat the enemy as cold as winter and as ruthless as the wind. The other is to publicize the consolation of the army in newspapers, and at the same time spread the news that the money used by the young Archduke to comfort the army was provided by the local gentry of Milan. In fact, people may not be so gullible when it comes to fake news like this, and those who gave gifts would not admit it either. However, coupled with the information about a series of projects contracted to individuals and commercial organizations, onlookers had to wonder whether there was any behind the scenes operation. Of course, it is not unusual to operate behind the scenes in this era, or it would be strange if there were no operations behind the scenes, but this makes a lot of sense in the eyes of some people. After all, they were plotting together to overthrow the decadent rule of Vienna, and then they turned around and donated money and materials to those executioners. And how could the Austrian army, which has always been in disrepair, destroy this seamless plan? The blood of the Italian warriors cannot be shed in vain. In fact, in the final analysis, the previous riots had the background of a multifaceted joint organization. An organization called Young Lombardy was responsible for recruiting manpower overseas. Friends are responsible for providing weapons and financial support. And it is the local gentry who are responsible for formulating plans and responses. They can use the power in their hands to help give the green light, convey intelligence, and hinder the Austrian soldiers. By the way, even if they fail, they can fish out the people. However, this group of eloquent eloquors finally stood aside and watched. Not only were the participants of this riot arrested, but also the organizers who were preparing for the second riot and the participants who fled. When the situation became worse, it was agreed that there would be only one company of garrison troops, but in the end they faced thousands of soldiers who were waiting for them. Those arrested were all insurgents from poor backgrounds and foreign friends who provided friendly sponsorship, but the local leading figures were unscathed. All this has to make people suspicious. After all, while the two parties suffered a devastating blow, the third party was not only fine, but also benefited. How could it not make people jealous? The truth is that the Austrian government did receive a lot of reports and obtained a lot of intelligence through investigations. However, precisely because there was so much information, it was difficult to identify the authenticity. Under such circumstances, it is impossible for the officials to take action rashly, let alone arrest all suspects. Although this may not paralyze the Lombardy region, the impact will definitely be worse than random arrests. Instead of making random guesses like headless flies, it is better to watch them quietly and wait until they are almost exhausted before taking action. By then, whether it is to accept the dog as a dog or to cut a bunch of leaks, it will be a matter of course. In fact, there is no need for France to stand in the way, because there has never been any trust between these three parties. There are different factions within almost each party. Many people in Young Lombardy did not support Mazzini's doctrine. They even did not want to unify Italy, but wanted to make northern Italy independent. After all, in their eyes, their relatives in the south were too poor and were a burden. Among the foreign friends are stars, including Britain, France, the United States, Prussia, Sardinia, and even the Russians. And the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies is the world's #1 troublemaker. It is normal for Britain to come to Apennine to interfere. As for France and the United States, one is an old enemy for hundreds of years, and the other is a new power that has been miserably offended. In fact, the grievances between Austria and the United States are not just about the US-Mexican War and the former's violation of the Monroe Declaration. Italy and Germany have always been important sources of immigrants to the United States, but now they rely on the two customs unions established by the Austrians to make the economic development of the two places much better than in history. This greatly reduced the willingness of local people to immigrate. Not only that, the latter also united with German and Italian states to directly intervene in immigration activities. Another point is the trade issue. Austria has been reducing the proportion of cotton imported from the United States. Although France has been very careful, the total amount has not decreased and has even increased, but some people have still discovered the flaw. Chapter 581 Haystack. Because the import volume has been growing explosively in the past few years, but after opening up more markets, Austria's import volume has increased very little, which aroused John Taylor's suspicion. Although the president was ousted, he still left a large amount of data and analysis to his successors. Before he stepped down, his successor, James Knox Polk, was a hardline xenophobe who would find any reason to prove that foreigners were a threat. However, although both sides dislike each other, business still has to be done. After all, Austria's textile industry has just started, and the United States of America has also been severely damaged by the war as a result. The latter retaliated against the former in this more secretive way. Prussia also did not want peace and stability in Austria, although at this time the former was at an absolute disadvantage in the competition with the latter, but it is far from time for Prussia to give up. After all, they have experienced more desperate scenes than this. In fact, what Prussia wanted to provoke most was Bohemia and Hungary, but the nationalist whirlpool in the former was too terrifying. The latter was deliberately isolated from the world by Austria, and its energy was much lower than before. Moreover, its internal chaos was so chaotic that it was difficult to organize an effective riot. Sardinia has been dissatisfied with Austria for a long time. Carlo Alberto has suffered from domestic riots and naturally hopes that his powerful neighbors can share the joys and sorrows with him. In fact, starting in 1841, due to the spread of revolutionary ideas, Carlo Alberto had to approve a decree to establish a representative government. This government is very radical, although it has not explicitly stated that it is anti-Austrian or anti-French. It has been making small moves in the Apennines. The Russians are very contradictory. On the one hand, they hope that Austria will expand to Italy. It would be best if they can directly capture Sardinia and then fight the French to a bloody head. But on the other hand, the Russians do not want Austria to be too powerful. Ferdinando II of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was a typical loser. He wanted to dominate the Apennine customs union and attack his competitors was a completely routine operation. But this is an ambition that cannot be realized at all, because the entire Apennine customs union is Austria's own toy, and there is no possibility of changing the chairman. Although there are many countries causing trouble, the only ones that can really have an impact on the situation in Italy are Britain, France, and Sardinia. However, these foreign forces are the key targets of the Austrian Empire at this time. After all, there is no room for negotiation with these invaders, and any compromise will only lead to more excessive demands. Next are the Italian nationalists. If you have to pick a country in Europe that is most afraid of nationalism, then it has to be the Austrian Empire. Italians, Germans, Hungarians, West Slavs, Yugoslavs, not to mention there are countless small branches under each grace. Although some countries have many ethnic groups, none has as few as Austria's main ethnic groups. What's even more frightening is that the enlightened monarchy that the empire has always implemented has made the Austrian nation more civilized and easily exposed to new ideas and easy to accept them. The entire empire is like a haystack. It only takes a few sparks to burn it to the ground. For the 1,300 captured participants and supporters of the riot, the Habsburg family still pardoned their capital crimes as before, and the price they paid was just to confess in front of the statue of the god in the church. But Franz did not intend to let them go back unharmed. He first took this group of people to the cemetery to confess to the sacrificed soldiers and innocent people. These sinners must then sign a support agreement in which they must bear the consequences of their crimes. A support agreement may include the payment of restitution or the payment of alimony to ensure that the victim or family receives the compensation they deserve. Naturally, the money must be compensated with their family property. If the family property is not enough, they must use labor to atone. Austria's colonies are in short supply of labor, and they can feed dozens or millions of people, let alone thousands. Of course, even those wealthy gentlemen could not escape punishment. After all, in addition to the innocent citizens and soldiers who needed compensation, the Austrian Empire also suffered great losses, including cities, reputation, etc. In short, no one can fill this black hole with money unless he can prove that he can create great value by staying in the country, such as inventions or achievements in music, art, technology, science, etc. And with this attitude of killing everyone Those young radicals who lack fighting experience will most likely choose to take desperate risks compared to the Verona fortress, where tens of thousands of troops were garrisoned. It was obvious that the local tycoons who had taken refuge in Austria were easier to kill. And the reason why those aristocratic families have been able to stand for 100 years, or even 1,000 years, is certainly not a waste of time. As a result, the two sides began a bloody mutual tearing, which caused a blood feud between the low-level radicals and the local high-level officials. However, it is not possible for every family to have the ability to protect itself. Those weak families can only seek asylum from the imperial government. This returns to what the Austrian Empire is best at, recruiting those weak families and letting them act as their informants and vanguard. Monitor those powerful families and work with officials sent from Vienna to limit the continued development of their power, and then find those that are easy to control and provide support, slowly transforming them. In fact, the internal and external environment of the Austrian Empire did not allow Franz to make big moves. After all, he was like a terminally ill patient who might die after a strong dose of medicine, so Franz adopted this alternative plan. At night, the streets of Milan were twinkling with lights. Only a tavern at the end of the road was still brightly lit. A faded wooden board hangs in front of the tavern with the words House of Sicilians written on it. A carriage as dark as ink stopped, and a person who was incompatible with the scene stepped out. 3 men and 2 women pushed open the door and entered. The tavern was filled with the choking smoke, the smell of wine, sweat, and all kinds of noisy sounds. The leading man frowned, but the beautiful woman walking in the middle didn't care. This group of people soon became the focus of everyone's attention, and a drunkard even teased the girl who was walking at the end with small steps. The result was that the thin figure knocked the person over with lightning speed and received a crossbar. The strong man tried his best to break free, but just when he was about to curse, he heard a gabba sound. The thin woman broke the man's arm without mercy, leaving only a heart-rending scream. Do you know whose territory this is? The strong man's partner immediately took out the knife, but just after taking a few steps forward, he was hit in the head by a wine bottle and fell to the ground. The bartender at the bar saw the bad guy and immediately reached for the shotgun behind him, but before he even touched the gun, he heard a gunshot. When he turned around again, 10 revolvers were already pointing at him. We're going to meet Al Pacino. Chapter 582 Godfather. Lombardy, Fortress of Verona. Al Pacino can't believe his ears until now, because he didn't expect that the big shot he wanted to meet was the young Archduke Franz. When the former was invited into the hall, his legs were dangling so much that he could hardly walk. When the waiter on the side asked him if he wanted tea or coffee, he paused for a long time before answering. The waiter did not express any disdain or contempt, but the Sicilian still felt uneasy. He was just an outsider who was forced by life and not even recognized by his compatriots. The young nobleman in front of him is very likely to be the most powerful person in this country in the future. The gap in origin and status between the two can be said to be worlds apart. But Archduke Franz did not keep him waiting long. Hello, Mr. Corleone. To be honest, Franz was a little surprised when he heard this name for the first time. Isn't this the last name of the Godfather? But now counting the years, the man in front of me may be the great-great-great-grandfather of the Godfather. Hello, Your Highness Archduke Franz. I'm really flattered by your invitation. As he spoke, Al Pacino Corleone's hands were trembling with excitement, and it could be seen that these 2 words of his were indeed sincere. In fact, Al Pacino is the spokesperson of the Sicilian Brotherhood in Lombardy, but this is just a non-governmental organization not recognized by the government. The biggest officials he had met before were just the police chief of a certain district in Milan, or officials from the port authority. And those so-called big shots were just a bunch of insects in front of the young man in front of him. In Corleone's mind, his Sicilian brothers were better and more capable than those northern Italians, and the hiring price was also lower, but outsiders like them from the so-called remote villages are often ostracized, whipped, beaten, and framed. Even the hard-earned money they have earned through hard work is often treated as unworthy. The cheapskate boss skimps. The bottom line of all this is that they have no backing. Brotherhood gangsters could reason with unscrupulous businessmen and shady factory owners. However, government officials and military officers would not reason with them. they would only tirelessly repeat the so-called evidence and contract. Al Pacino, who has tasted the ups and downs of the world, the wind, frost, snow, and rain, felt like a mirror at this time. The big man in front of him was undoubtedly the ladder for him to climb up. As long as you do well and achieve results, not only will you be able to prosper, but your brothers in the fraternity will also be able to benefit from it and become true Austrians. Thinking of this, he said, "Your Highness, I know who participated in the plot of the riot. Although not all of them, as long as you give me a little time, I will definitely figure it out for you. I swear to God." "You seem a little excited. Let's have a drink first to calm down." As he spoke, Franz shook his head. Apparently the other party didn't know that this was not his main concern. Al Pacino was a little confused. After all, he felt that he had just taken out the biggest bargaining chip in his hand. For this rare opportunity today, he can be said to have done enough homework, especially regarding the evidence of Vera Riva. He wanted to find a chance to bring down the vampire at the last banquet, but was defeated by the young man in front of him. Interrupted the Archduke's father, but now Franz Joseph seemed to have a completely indifferent expression on his face, which made Al Pacino have to think quickly. The latter knew that he must have some indispensable value to the former, so he was invited to meet him. And Al Pacino wanted desperately to know what valuable information he could provide. In fact, Franz would not completely believe the so-called intelligence and evidence of this Sicilian, because he, like those officials, had a competitive relationship with the locals, so the authenticity and accuracy of the things he provided could not be guaranteed at all. Seeing how hard the other party was thinking, Franz spoke. "I have heard about your deeds and admire your courage. It's just that you were a little too impulsive. If it hadn't been for my father, no one in a higher position would have tolerated your offense." Although the young Archduke's tone was calm, it was still like thunder in Al Pacino's ears. After all, there is a warning in this sentence. The latter is not a fool. He can mix the words of a dock worker into a brotherhood, and people will naturally hear the implication. After all, airplanes don't require brains, and you can only be a young and dangerous kid for the rest of your life. Your words make me feel frightened. I wonder what I can do for you, Franz. I know you are courageous, and you are also dissatisfied with the bad situation in northern Italy. Likewise, I know very well what happened to you, and those who came later, and even more clearly what those local officials did. But some things are not that simple. The more senior a person is, the less able they are to act as they wish. Al Pacino cautiously said, "So you want me to help you kill all those villains, Franz?" "No, if lynching is used, wouldn't I be like them? But I hope you can continue to uphold justice. The Empire needs people like you." These words made Al Pacino a little confused. If there is no need for lynching, wouldn't it be better to just let the police do it? Why are you looking for a gang member like him? In fact, Franz didn't want to use this method, but the northern Italy's bureaucracy was in chaos. If he continued to expand his power, something might happen. Al Pacino tentatively asked, "What do I do, Franz?" "I need the new immigrants' lives to be effectively protected, so that they can settle down and start a business without being bullied. In addition, I will hand over part of the construction of the fortress to you." Al Pacino replied with some embarrassment, "But I don't have the funds at all." Franz smiled awkwardly. "It doesn't matter. I didn't make it clear just now. I will pay your wages every month, so you don't have to worry about this. But I still need you to do something, and that is to ensure that there are no anti-Austrian groups among immigrants. Of course, if there are other civil society groups that plan to do this, you can also write to me. In addition, if any officials, nobles, or businessmen have such intentions, you can report them to me, as long as you have sufficient evidence. I will handle these matters as appropriate, but keep in mind that there will be no personal vendettas involved. Otherwise, I will be very disappointed." In fact, the final result of the conversation was pretty much what Al Pacino expected, but the process made him feel uncomfortable. But maybe the big shot did have more worries, and even doing good seemed so cumbersome. "Your Highness the Grand Duke, please believe me, I will not let you down. I thank you on behalf of my compatriots in Sicily and all the new immigrants. You are really..." Franz waved his hand, his ears already ringing with praise. "Someone will bring you specific documents and contracts later. If there's nothing special, I'll excuse you now, Franz. Left the living room, and side point, I hope this godfather can complete his work well, attract a little more firepower to the empire, and buy a little more time for this precarious country. Chapter 583 Radetzky. The fortress of Verona is located on the Adio River south of the city, and includes an entire fortress complex, an artificial moat, and a bridge point. The fortress is surrounded by the Adio River on 3 sides, and can only be attacked from the southwest. It is a typical classical fortress. The advantage of this kind of fortress is that it has only one entrance and exit. As long as the entrance is blocked, the enemy will not be able to get in. The disadvantage is that there is only one exit, so the enemy will not be able to get out as long as the entrance is blocked. In fact, the so-called 4-corner fortresses have this problem to a greater or lesser extent. Among them, Prussia Fortress, the only one with 2 entrances and exits, was also the only fortress that was captured by the army of the Kingdom of Sardinia. 4 corners, Verona, Mantua, Prussia and Lignago. As the most important stronghold of the Austrian Empire in northern Italy, Verona is not lightly defended, but in recent years the empire's money has been mainly spent on economy, scientific research and infrastructure. The defense facilities of the Verona fortress have lagged behind the times, but although they are old, they do not feel dilapidated. There is no doubt that someone is carefully maintaining them. It's very beautiful. This is the best fortress in northern Italy, but if possible, I hope it will remain abandoned. The person who spoke was a tall, energetic, and kind-faced old general. He was the highest military commander in northern Italy, Marshal Radetzky. Standing next to him was a young man with extraordinary bearing, and the young man's drunken father Franz could naturally hear the worry in the old marshal's heart. But what was coming would always come, and there was no way to avoid it. Franz, Marshal, have you heard anything? People's lives are so happy that they have forgotten the pain of war. The empire's tolerant policy has also increased the ambitions of some people. They feel that this country is weak and can be bullied. And the most important point is that, since you have decided to repair this fortress that has been neglected for decades, it is enough to prove that the Imperial Center knows the situation here better than we do. Historically, it was in a semi-abandoned state after 1809. As expected, people become better with age, and it is obviously their own judgment, and they also need to bring the Imperial Center with them. In fact, the old marshal knew the situation in northern Italy better than the people in the Regency Council. It had been far away from the war for too long. After the external conflicts were downgraded, the internal conflicts became the main contradiction point. Although the tariffs in northern Italy and Lusitania have been abolished after a series of reforms at this time, there are still many historical problems plaguing this region. In addition, with Hungary as a negative example, people think it's impossible without extra thoughts. This is not what the Regent Council meant. It was my idea. Franz simply showed his cards directly. He didn't feel the need to hide anything. The old marshal still looked a little in disbelief. Although he had heard from his old boss, Archduke Karol, that Franz was not an ordinary brat, he still couldn't believe his ears. After all, the cost of infrastructure renovation on such a large area is astronomical. Even if the country pays for it, it still needs to be paid in installments. However, the young man in front of him said it was his own wish. What does this mean? What do you mean? But where does the money come from? Let them come out on their own. Franz smiled and told all about how he deceived these speculators and investment businessmen. Radetzky found it unbelievable, but when he thought about it carefully, it seemed reasonable. Everything in this country was originally developing for the better, coupled with the Habsburg family's reputation and the behemoth Austrian Empire as a guarantee. The money seemed really not worth mentioning. Of course, in this world, it seems that this kind of thing can only happen in the Austrian Empire, and indeed it can only be done by Archduke Franz. After all, he is most likely to be the future emperor. Archduke Franz, this is really a genius idea, but what if there is no unrest in the country within 5 years? And it is more beneficial than the uprising in Italy. Hungary is a real problem. Radetzky expressed his concern that, if large-scale unrest did not occur within 5 years, Franz would have to pay a huge sum point, and what if after the unrest breaks out in Hungary, the Italians shrink back, because the situation is not right? Don't worry, the economy of the Austrian Empire will reach a new level in 5 years. It won't be a problem to pay back the money by then. Franz couldn't tell the other party that he was a time traveler. 3 years later, not only Austria, but the whole of Europe would be bombed, so those people must not return the money. Fortunately, the changes in the Austrian Empire over the years have been obvious to all, and Marshal Radetzky notes that some of the pensions that should have been paid during the Holy Roman Empire have been paid. Moreover, the army has replaced equipment 3 times on a large scale in the past 8 years, and has never been in arrears with military pay in the past 5 years. The reason why the soldiers in Milan were so brave before was that they knew that advancing will be rewarded, retreating will be punished, and injury will be punished. If you have medical treatment, you can die with comfort. In fact, it also has something to do with the commander's reputation and style. Although Radetzky was romantic, he always owed debts in his own name and never deducted the military pay of his subordinates. In addition, Radetzky's style allowed Franz to redefine the term romantic. The 79-year-old marshal found a 46-year-old Italian aunt as his lover. This Italian aunt, named Miragioli, was a poor person. She married 2 husbands and both died unexpectedly. Her only son died in pain due to dysentery. From then on, she was considered an unlucky person, and the people in the village drove her to live outside the village. Marshal Radetzky, who had just arrived in Lombardy to take up his post, happened to lead his troops through her village. Not wanting to disturb the people and wrong himself, the old marshal stayed overnight in a dilapidated house at the end of the village. As a result, the two met again. Although the old marshal owed a lot of debt, he was still very generous to women. Naturally, there were many empty rooms for a woman living alone, so she agreed to the old marshal's request to stay overnight. At that time, the landlord usually had to take care of the food, so Radetzky naturally didn't want to eat the cake. So the woman made some pumpkin balls with the only pumpkin and oil at home. After eating, the old marshal was very satisfied and found that the people in the village didn't seem to respect the woman in front of him. At that time, Miragioli was visibly depressed, with unkempt hair, ragged clothes with countless patches, and a dirty apron. The house at home looked like an abandoned hunting lodge, with only some salvaged items in the kitchen, scattered vegetable leaves and oddly shaped pumpkins. Marshal Radetzky had seen so many things in his life that he quickly understood what women were going through. It happened that he didn't know this land yet and there was no one around him to take care of it, so he said to the woman, "Ma'am, will you take care of me?" An old man, willing, then molecularly became Radetzky's nanny. Although the latter was over 70 years old, his humor was not inferior to that of the young people, and he was a true nobleman and a true gentleman. Miragioli is a virtuous woman with the unique enthusiasm and simplicity of the Italians. She is no longer discriminated against in the military and regarded as an ominous existence. Like Fantine in Les Miserables, after being cleansed and fed, Miragioli becomes plump and charming. Then, she regained her second youth and soon fell in love with the old marshal. It's just that the worldly view scares her. Fortunately, Marshal Radetzky is an informal person. When their contract expired, the old marshal found a woman again. "Madam, will you continue to take care of me?" An old man. "I do, my lord." "This is a long-term contract." "How long?" "Lifetime." Chapter 584, Rubber and Deserters. At this time, the Austrian Empire did not owe military pay as it did in history, so most of its troops were at full strength. The weapons and food stocks in the fortress are enough to last for more than a year. In addition, because the rubber trees in the Chenla area have finally matured, the Austrian army has begun to fully install rubber shoes. Of course, this still aroused opposition from some officers. As for the reasons, they are a bit strange. Too ugly, an aristocratic officer ordered and threw the new M1845 military rubber shoes to the ground. This khaki junk was completely inferior to his noble black leather shoes. Another officer, "It really doesn't look good, but this thing is quite durable, and it only stipulates that soldiers must wear it. There is no uniform requirement for officers. There is only one bottom line, and that is decency." After hearing what the latter said, the former breathed a sigh of relief and asked, "What if those soldiers also think they are too ugly?" In Reality, this was all a fool's errand, as shoes of this era were expensive, and generally neither durable nor comfortable. Point of course, there are some shoes that are durable and comfortable, but the price is not affordable for ordinary soldiers. Generally speaking, these new canvas, rubber shoes are durable and more comfortable than most shoes of this era. The most important thing is that they are free of charge. Then let's talk about the appearance. Franz has seen and worn old-fashioned yellow rubber shoes, 99 type, 07 type, and 21 type. In terms of performance, the newer the better. However, considering the actual situation at the time, type 07 and type 21 could not be manufactured at all. The old-fashioned yellow rubber shoes were too low, so the type 99 was finally selected. However, since camouflage canvas could not be produced in this era, yellow cloth could only be used in the end. Instead, this can be regarded as a kind of inheritance of yellow rubber shoes. However, ordinary soldiers did not feel ugly. On the contrary, the uniform style and color of the shoes made them feel cool. In fact, there were no so-called standard military shoes in this era. Countries with better conditions would at most hire a few military shoemakers to help make shoes, but most of them were handmade products with varying levels of quality and a variety of materials. The earliest standard military shoes in history appeared in Prussia in 1866. At that time, Bismarck, the iron-blooded prime minister, in order to boost morale on the eve of the Austro-Prussian War, equipped more than 50,000 soldiers with brown leather boots. Therefore, the Austrian soldiers at this time still strongly supported this standard equipment, and the logistics troops also praised rubber tires at this time. The hollow rubber tires equipped by the Austrian army did not have many advantages over the old wooden wheels. Whether it was shock absorption, pressure resistance, wear resistance, or friction with the ground, the former completely overwhelmed the latter. Therefore, Austria's troops are not only powerful where there are railway lines, but their field supply capabilities are also the first in Europe at this time. The emergence of hollow tires led to a revolution in the wheel industry in the Austrian Empire. The wheel standards that had not been unified for thousands of years also changed at this time. All wheels must be produced according to tire standards, otherwise even the best wheels will be difficult to sell. Because even if the wheels are wrapped with rubber, it is still far from the effect of hollow tires closer to home. According to Marshal Radetzky, with the training level and firepower intensity of the Kingdom of Sardinia, it is simply impossible to conquer northern Italy with only 100,000 people. The old man even thought that he could keep the enemy out of the country, but Franz still denied this crazy idea. After all, by then Marshal Radetzky might not be able to dispatch troops as easily as he does now. Franz then asked another pointed question. Marshal, if a war breaks out between us and the Italian nationalists, how many Italians will rebel? Radetzky was a little surprised, but thought about it seriously. According to past experience, it should be 5% minus 8%. Generally speaking, their number is less than half of the deserters. The old marshal joked. Desertion has always been a big problem in the 19th century. Taking Russia as an example, the desertion rate was as high as more than 5% even during non-wartime. During the same period in the US-Mexican War, the desertion rate on both sides was over 20%, and the desertion rate among some Mexican troops was as high as 35%. Cruel wars, infectious diseases, poor treatment, and the withholding of military pay may all cause deserters. The Austrian Empire is a country with mountains, swamps, and complex terrain. Often several soldiers would get together, steal weapons from the army, and flee into the mountains and swamps. Generally speaking, the chief officer will not report deserters, nor will he send troops to encircle and suppress soldiers, but will only report the natural loss of firearms. This is also an important reason why soldiers are only given a small number of bullets. These deserters usually have to survive. They are unwilling to work hard, and do not have land, tools and other means of production, so most of these people choose to become bandits. Rampant banditry, in turn, affects economic development and food production. The country has no food and money to appease the army, let alone money to suppress bandits. The result is a vicious circle. However, the Austrian Empire's economy had made great progress at this time, so military pay and food were guaranteed. Although the treatment was slightly lower than workers' wages, it was still much better than the same period in history. In addition, Austria has been victorious in almost all the wars it has participated in over the years, so the morale of the army is relatively high, and there has been no large-scale desertion. However, the phenomenon of desertion has not been eliminated, especially when fighting jointly with the German armies. The number of deserters increased significantly. Although Marshal Radetzky said it in a joke, Franz knew that the desertion problem would seriously plague the country in the future. In fact, Franz has not considered solving this problem, but all he can do is solve the worries of these soldiers at the same time. Victory and heroes are used to numb their nerves. It is not yet known how much other ideas, such as loyalty to the emperor, patriotism and religion, can play a role. As for the military reform to improve organization, Count Latter was very talkative in this regard. After receiving the approval of Archduke Karol, the former was determined to comprehensively promote the staff system. Franz actually planned to directly extend this staff system to the company level and use it as political commissars for future generations. However, the actual situation was that Austria simply could not produce so many qualified officers, and most of them failed to pass the political review. In the end, we could only take a few steps back to the regiment level, but since there was no field radio, it was still difficult to achieve unified command. During this period, Archbishop Prussia also asked Franz whether he could use military chaplains to replace the role of staff. After all, the church was absolutely loyal to the empire. This was immediately rejected by Franz. Although there are many chaplains in the army, these people generally do not understand military affairs and are prone to extremes. If a wave of hot-blooded soldiers were sent or surrendered, wouldn't it be a big loss? Already, mainly because this approach reminded Franz of the political commissar system of Su and Su in later generations. In order not to repeat the same mistakes, he must be cautious. Chapter 585 Questionnaire Survey. Regarding the question of Italian nationalists, Marshal Radetzky's advice was, it's better to ask directly. Although it sounds a bit weird, it is still quite efficient. Italian soldiers generally said that they were not familiar with the northern Italians, and as for the southern Italians, they were simply sworn enemies. Of course they prefer to say those are Sardinians, Lombards, Venetians, Lucca, Parma, Modenese, Tuscans, Romans, Papal States, Neapolitans, Sicilians. It seems that the propaganda of the Austrian Empire over the years has not been in vain. In fact, most of the troops are poor people who are not accepted by the local society. They naturally have no good impression of those who abandon them. All Franz had to do was keep them winning and have money to buy drinks after the victory. Relatively speaking, the Illyrians and Hungarians in Italy are a problem. This is not because they are deeply influenced by Great Hungarianism, but because these people have long been accustomed to doing things with money, and they have very different concepts of country and nation. Light Illyrians are the general name for Slovenes, Serbs, Croatians, and Montenegrins in the Austrian Empire. Only half of the troops stationed in Italy were Italians, and the remaining half were composed of Germans, Illyrians, Hungarians, and Czechs. This is also a feature of the Austrian Empire. The advantage is that it prevents a certain nation from becoming bigger and unable to stop it when a rebellion occurs, but the disadvantage is that there are many hills inside the army, and the ethnic composition is complex, and it is difficult to unified command. A low-level officer who wants to effectively command his team needs to learn at least 3 or more foreign languages, and spend a lot of time communicating. Not to mention the issue of training. Compared to verbal communication, sticks and whips are extremely useful. The handbook of 20 words must know on the battlefield has been promoted for 9 years. In fact, during the Napoleonic Wars, Archduke Karol presided over this military reform. However, the reform failed in the later period, and coupled with the opposition of the Hungarians, this reform it was covered in dust. Franz proposed this reform again in 1836, and Count Latter, Minister of War, followed suit and continued it. Today, must know 20 words has become, must know 50 words. In fact, there were must know 100 words, and must know 120 words in the middle, but it is too difficult for recruits. It's complicated, so I can only give up. Franz conducted several inspections and found that the sampling pass rate of the Italian army's 50 words you must know on the battlefield is over 90%, which is higher than the national average, 60%. If the Hungarian military district is excluded, the average can be close to 75%. The sampling pass rate of must know 20 words is extremely close to 100%. They all know it and can hear it, but a few people can't spell it. The military as a whole has no revolutionary tendencies and its combat effectiveness is adequate. However, Franz flipped through the officer roster and couldn't help but gasped. The names of two great men, Fernand Lizzi and Alois Palfi, were clearly listed. Fernand Lizzi was the ruthless man who later surrendered Venice to the rebels without firing a shot and fled all the way from northern Italy to the beaches of Brussels, Belgium. His life experience can be described as extremely glorious. He was captured twice and was severely wounded by the rebels many times. The Austrian army suffered huge losses in every battle in his hands. Knowing the rebels' plan in advance, he led 2 full brigades to encircle and suppress the Carbonari rebels. The strength of both sides was 10,000 against 800. As a result, almost all important figures including Garibaldi were released, 26 people were captured, and more than 100 enemy soldiers were killed, while their own losses were more than 10 times that of the opponent. Another heavyweight, Alois Palfi, was a real master of surrender. In the stormy year of 1848, he led 3 legions in northern Italy, Bohemia, and Hungary, all with one shot. No hair. What is even more incredible is that people within the Austrian Empire always believe that this man is a genius and will launch an attack. Franz looked at Alois Palfi's resume. He was a typical young man. He entered the military academy at the age of 8 and graduated at the age of 12. He was proficient in all tactics such as artillery, cavalry, and infantry. After graduation, he directly served as a lecturer at the Dessau Military Academy, the highest military academy in the Austrian Empire, responsible for teaching a series of important subjects such as campaign theory, war science, and artillery science. The various medals, certificates, and honorary titles awarded at home and abroad can almost fill 2 pages. How can such a long ocean perform so well? Franz later asked some professionals. Friedrich said that he was not familiar with this guy, and Archduke Karol's reply was unimpressive. Albrecht said that the guy was an idiot and his course was a piece of shit, but of course it was fine if it was just a story. Count later sent a copy of Franz Joseph's resume, and the latter roughly understood it. After reading it, Alois Palfi is completely a product of God making, an artificial idol created by a large family at the expense of manpower and financial resources. In order to promote its legal heir, Franz was going to take the pair of sleeping dragons and phoenixes to Hungary and let them fend for themselves. If they could survive the desperate situation and explode the small universe to do something, they would be worthy of the wages they had received over the years. If they die, it can only be said to be bad luck, and it will have no impact on the Austrian Empire. However, they soon encountered the joint opposition of Prince Metternich and Count Korolaf in the Regent Council. In fact, it was impossible to know that there was no support behind this pair of sleeping dragons and phoenixes. Moreover, in a land as sacred as northern Italy, it is impossible for big shots not to come in and get involved. It seems that this plan can only be shelved temporarily, but Franz is not in a hurry. After all, he still has 3 years to do a lot. The local gentry and nationalists in Lombardy were not all idiots. Some people analyzed that the Austrian Empire wanted them to kill each other, but they could not explain it clearly, let alone explain it. So someone really took the risk and launched an attack on the Verona fortress, but their caravan and death squads were intercepted before they saw the shadow of the Verona fortress. Franz still admires this kind of group that dares to openly assassinate, so they must be uprooted. Most of the members of the so-called Drass Brotherhood were quickly captured through the joint efforts of many parties. In addition to their supporters, including several very influential local nobles, the families behind these people sent envoys hoping to negotiate with the empire, but Franz didn't mind killing the 9 clans. It was not unusual at that time for people to resort to beatings. After obtaining strong evidence, the Lombardy regional government carried out a quick and thorough crackdown on those who dared to openly assassinate the royal family and commit treason. Afterwards, nearly 3,000 people embarked on the ship to the colonies. Chapter 586 Franz's plan. The city of Verona is still very beautiful, but this city is famous thanks to Shakespeare and his opera Romeo and Juliet. Legend has it that Shakespeare accidentally heard the story of a young man from two feuding families who died for love in a cafe, and was inspired to write that legendary masterpiece. Franz even went to the balcony to take a look, but it was a bit disappointing. For the first time, he felt that cultural relic protection organizations were so important. At this time, Juliet's former residence was actually a hotel. There were potholes and muddy roads, two third-rate prostitutes stood at the door, and a disgusting stench came from the house. The walls were covered with obscenities, and from time to time you could hear the voices of prostitutes and clients bargaining inside. Seeing this scene, a Jenny whispered in Franz's ear, "Would you like to go in and experience it? Sign up as a member and unlock more." "No need." Franz interrupted her immediately, and then ordered the coachman to go back. Franz, have someone by that hotel. Is this all you want? Over the years, Jenny has long been accustomed to Franz's language habits, and joked in return. Franz said helplessly, "I just want a hotel, no people." Jenny said with a slight disappointment, "Oh, I thought you discovered some extraordinary person living inside again." Franz, "I plan to set up a cultural relics protection organization. You go and find a way to recruit some people." Jenny, when the French enacted the world's first cultural relics protection law in 1840, didn't you say they wasted money and energy on a useless effort? Franz, well, I admit that I underestimated Louis Philippe. I thought he was just a fool who enjoyed his success, but when I saw those cultural monuments being so ruined, I really couldn't help but have the urge to hit people. Maybe I'm becoming more and more like an Austrian." Jenny asked, "You are not Austrian. How can you be anyone else?" Franz was not interested in continuing this topic, and just casually said, "It doesn't matter who it is, maybe a Frenchman." Jenny smiled awkwardly and said, "You are really funny." Then she overinterpreted this sentence. One good thing about Austria is that it has no shortage of artistic talents. Cultural relics protection organizations are easily established, and accordingly there is a set of protection laws. It's just that Franz's behavior is considered by the aristocratic circle as throwing money, just like scientific research. In their eyes, the protection of cultural relics is nothing more than a group of giant babies who are unwilling to give up the toys in their hands and embrace the new era. Idiot move. In fact, the protection of cultural relics is not completely without value. Let's not talk about the virtual value, just say that the tourism value is enough to maintain the normal operation of these cultural relics protection organizations. In fact, its spiritual value is far greater than its material value. Franz once stood in the Heroes' Square to admire the bronze statue of Prince Eugen. It is difficult to say how much the prancing horse and whip affected him. The future of the Austrian Empire will be a supranational state, and the inheritance of culture will be particularly important, so Franz does not feel that he has made a loss-making business. I still point it out clearly here, because I feel like not many people will read it. If I write a foreshadowing, of course, it was not just this incident that caused Franz's criticism in Vienna. In fact, his liquidation of assassins and conspirators in Lombardy caused panic among aristocratic circles. After all, the nobles of the upper class have long been accustomed to the law does not punish the public, the harm does not affect the family, and the Habsburg family is benevolent. But Franz's approach is really a bit too cruel, extreme. In fact, this is the legacy accumulated over hundreds of years. Because there is no figure like Qin Shi Huang in Europe, this leads to excessive power of local and aristocratic places and too weak imperial power. However, because the French Revolution swept away the nobility and local forces, it strengthened the power of the emperor and the central government. In the Austrian Empire at this time, the emerging bureaucratic aristocracy overwhelmed the traditional aristocracy. The former's power came from the emperor, and naturally it was impossible to cause trouble for the future emperor Franz. As a result, the attitude of the entire aristocratic circle towards this matter became polarized. Traditional aristocrats felt that Franz was extreme and cruel. The emerging bureaucratic aristocracy felt that exile was merciful, and that concealing and trying to cover up was also a sin. Franz's behavior was reasonable and legal. In fact, the confrontation between foreign officials and local officials in northern Italy also had this reason. The traditional nobles were suppressed and could only serve as low-level officials. However, the foreign senior officials had no foundation, so the two sides began to compete endlessly for the power in their hands. Of course, Franz was not prepared to give too many reasons to discredit himself. He had already obtained the criminal evidence and confession of those traitors before. Naturally, no one can refute the irrefutable evidence. At the same time, the exile was changed to compensation for work. Franz directly transformed political and moral issues into legal and economic issues. After all, issues of rules are much easier to explain than issues of principle, so those who previously criticized Franz for being cruel and extreme now changed their tune and said that he was a national model in handling everything impartially. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Kagura suddenly kicked out a blow that changed the line and swept high. The speed was very fast and the angle was tricky. However, due to its light weight, its power was limited. As Franz retreated, he grabbed her trousers and pulled her, and the latter made a straight horse in the air. There are too many fancy moves. If you want to make a sneak attack, you have to focus on speed and strength. Your body is already weak, and with the line changes and pauses, you don't have much strength left. Yes, if Franz's opponent had been a man, he would have basically lost consciousness. If women had not exercised for a long time and had good body flexibility, they would have lost the ability to move. Kagura's body has both of the above. That's it for today's physical training. Let's check for injuries first, then run 10,000 meters, and then do shooting training. At least there should be no miss within 20 meters. Yes, Kagura's expression didn't change, but she still admired Franz in her heart. But the latter asked the former not to express his emotions and anger, let alone let others know what you were thinking, so she could only make a smile. A non-smiling expression. After Kagura left the room, a Jenny came over. That little girl is so bored. She's been bullied like this all day long and has nowhere to vent. I'm afraid she'll get sick sooner or later. It's normal for a girl from Izumo country to be a little morbid, and if she doesn't have strong mental power and sufficient strength to do the tasks she's given later, it's the same as sending her to death. Ajani spread her hands and said, okay, but I still think the dance she practiced is completely useless. Franz reminded, karate, with her physical fitness, I'm afraid her kicks won't be very powerful, right? Ajani turned around and kicked as she spoke. Her physical fitness was much better than Kagura's. After all, her height and weight were their point, but it was the same for Franz. The latter first dodged sideways, then wrapped his arms around the former's thigh and pulled him. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 587 Explain. It hurts. It seems that this action is still a bit too extreme for a 30-year-old woman. Jenny looks resentful. Maybe she needs a little help. Franz walked over apologetically, preparing to help the former up, but he was obviously careless. This was completely a trap. As soon as Franz stretched out his hand, he was caught by Jenny. Then the latter's feet went around the back of the former's head like a snake and entangled the former. The twist is formed. This is a relatively classic killing move in judo, but it is also the most criticized. After all, scenes of violent attacks on this move are often seen in various comic novels, and highlights in cage fighting competitions such as MMA and UFC are infinitely magnified. This is possible. In fact, it is almost impossible to break the formed triangle, especially the legendary dirty tricks such as crotch picking, eye penetration, biting, tickling the soles of the feet, and scratching the creaking holes. The only way to do it is to beg for mercy and shoot floor. Fortunately, the two sides were just playing around, and Ajani did not exert any force. How's it going? Are you still playing? Okay, admit defeat. Admit defeat. Ajani. Why don't you struggle, Franz? Forget it. Forget it. This position is really uncomfortable. Let's play a little longer. It's rare for me to win. At this time, Mrs. Sophie opened the door and walked in. Seeing this scene, the two young maids beside her quickly covered their mouths, covered their eyes with their hands, and then carefully observed through the gaps between their fingers. Mrs. Sophie, what are you doing? Mother, I didn't tell you. What are you still doing here, madam? Sophie said sternly, and the two maids quickly went out and closed the door. Mrs. Sophie turned around and bolted the door, then grabbed a stool and sat down, raising her feet and speaking slowly. Tell me, what are you doing? Franz glanced at Jenny, who just closed her eyes and lay on the carpet. Franz sighed helplessly and was stopped by Mrs. Sophie just as he was about to stand up. Don't move. Just stay in this position and speak clearly. Franz had no choice but to put Jenny's legs on his shoulders again. We're wrestling, Mrs. Sophie. I'm asking you, what have you done recently to make the old diehards in Vienna and those Italians go crazy? Franz, it's a shame that the rabbit dies and the fox dies. They reject all reforms and hope that we can continue to exist as mascots as we did in the past. But the wishful thinking of those old antiques was wrong. This is an era of change. Change leads to generalization, and change leads to blockage. Change leads to prosperity, and change leads to decline. Change leads to survival, and change leads to death. Moreover, the balance of power has changed. From now on, they will become weaker and weaker. If we continue to stay together with them for warmth, we are seeking death. Mrs. Sophie originally had a lot to say because she felt that Franz's approach was too radical. Although it was conclusive evidence, it disappointed many people. What those people wanted to see was Habsburg. The Ford families. Let's forget bygones. Now that those people have suffered a heavy loss, they will definitely not give up. Although they dare not show it now, they might one day add insult to injury and even lead to a civil war or a tragic disaster like the French Revolution. You'd better not forget the failure of Joseph II. He was more qualified to be emperor than you and had more cards in his hand, but he still failed. Franz Joseph II's reforms were too radical, and he couldn't tell who was the enemy and who was the friend. It can even be said that he had no friends or enemies. Everyone was the target of his reforms. Mrs. Sophie, the merits and demerits of your ancestors should not be evaluated by you, a little brat. You should be cautious in your actions before becoming the emperor. Isn't it good to make subtle reforms like before? The Austrian Empire is now undoubtedly the second most powerful country in Europe. It has won hundreds of military battles, and its economy has undergone visible changes. Even the royal family's annuity has doubled several times. France, mother, crises are always where we can't see them. Moreover, our economy is highly dependent on external markets and raw materials, and the Hungarians who have been dormant for a long time are always a threat to us. In fact, the Austrian Empire's domestic market was not small, and it had almost everything. However, it was only self-sufficient at best, and could not support it from becoming a powerful country. Mrs. Sophie, I don't know what you are fighting against all day long, but the Hungarians can hardly pose a threat. Nearly a quarter of the great nobles have joined your plan. Especially after the construction of the St. Stephen's Crown Line began. Many people have realized the reality. They know that the king's power will be eternal, and they themselves are just dust streaked by meteors. Hungary will cease to exist in just a few decades. So what do you have to worry about when you are still in your prime? Theoretically speaking, if the current trend continues to develop steadily, Hungary's privileged class will gradually disappear. So-called privileges will also disappear, and then there will be no resistance to reform. But reality is often cyclical, and it cannot always be smooth sailing. Moreover, the great aristocracy will decline without the help of the big nobles. At that time, new forces will appear to continue to obstruct the pace of reform. Franz, mother, that is just the wishful thinking of the great nobles. Their number only accounts for 1/1000th of the Hungarian people, and even all the nobles together only account for 5% of the total population. We can't convince them one by one, so there are some things I have to do, otherwise it may be too late. Mrs. Sophie sighed. I know I can't convince you. I just hope you can trust your family. We will always be your backing. Mrs. Sophie turned and left, took 2 steps, and then stopped and said, it is not good for your health to engage in prostitution in the daytime. Franz quickly pushed Ajani away, and the latter took the opportunity to sneak into the room. February 7th, 1845, Spring Festival. The British government officially signed a lease agreement for Mayerport with the Nanming government. The lease term is 20 years, and the annual rent is 10,000 taels of silver, which is approximately 20 times that of renting in Kowloon, Hong Kong. At the same time, the two sides also signed a trade agreement, and the British promised not to sell opium and opium products to the Nanming area point in February of the same year. The British Army went north to negotiate with the Qing government on the piracy issue point on February 12. 1845, the Nanming Army launched a comprehensive encirclement and suppression of the Manchu remnants in central Kalimantan point on February 24, 1845. The Dutch East India Company did not send troops to rescue Capitan. As agreed, Liu Gan, the self-proclaimed commander-in-chief of Lanfang, was killed in battle. At this point, all forces loyal to the Manchu king on Kalimantan were eliminated. On March 11, 1845, the Nanming government handed over a series of secret formulas such as Ma Yinglang obtained by spies to the Austrian Imperial Church. Soon the sales volume of Ma Yinglang surpassed that of Allicin and others, becoming the best-selling medicine in Austria. The cavalryman couldn't put it down for this oriental lipstick. After a long journey, wearing one made it feel so sour. In fact, horse riding was still a very important sport in aristocratic circles at that time, so oriental lipstick became a hot topic in aristocratic circles for a while. Chapter 588 Allies on the Island of Ireland. In 1845, there were already many organizations on the island of Ireland trying to fight for the rights of the Irish. In addition to the two more radical organizations, Young Ireland and the Irish Liberator, there were, for example, the Orange Order composed of Irish Protestants, and the Defender League, which was mainly Catholic, was supported by the French. Of course, there is also Daniel O'Connell's Catholic Association. This organization is equally radical, but its leadership is extraordinary. He accomplished something that many Irish people had not dared to think of for hundreds of years. The Catholic Emancipation Act. O'Connell's political skills were superb. He could always find a balance between unrest and protest. He liked to use large rallies to put pressure on the government. In 1843 alone, he mobilized more than 30 people and hundreds of thousands of people. Although there were large gatherings mentioned above, no violence occurred. At the same time, O'Connell also formed an alliance with the Whigs, because the two had a common enemy, the Tories. In addition, he is also looking for supporters overseas, but this man is very smart. He will not leave any promises when asking for help, let alone contact any political figures, to leave others with evidence of treason. The first thing Robert Peel's government did, when they came to power, was to imprison him, and try to coerce him into using his entire family fortune and his status as a member of the House of Lords. But Daniel O'Connell did not surrender, but regained his freedom under the active rescue of his allies. The Whigs. Robert Peel later tried to divide O'Connell's organization by increasing grants to Maynooth Seminary and creating 3 universities open to some Catholics, but failed. O'Connell believed that only through parliamentary reform could Ireland gain self-government. His idea was clearly unhistorical. After all, both the Tories and the Whigs regarded it as a tool in political struggle. Franz also had different views from O'Connell, and Ireland's peaceful self-government was not in line with the interests of the Austrian Empire, but this did not affect the cooperation between the two. Moreover, the Austrian Imperial Church sent doctrinally proficient priests to the island of Ireland to support it in a reasonable manner. Who makes the Irish people's literacy rate low. At this time, the number of Austrian priests stationed on the island of Ireland exceeded 3,000, and there were nearly 500 other affairs officers. This made Archbishop Roche very confused. He didn't know what would happen in this land, and what was worth doing. After all, judging from the intelligence collected, this place only highlights the word poverty. The people are terribly poor. The priests can only rely on relief from their own country to survive. The tithes paid by the Irish are almost negligible. Even if you want to use it to contain the British, you can't do it. After all, they have neither weapons nor training. And historically speaking, Spain, the Netherlands, and France have all supported the Irish, but the results were a complete failure. This is enough to prove the stability of British rule in Ireland, and the church does not like O'Connell very much. Because there are many indications that the latter had been selling lists of his supporters and Austrian missionaries to the British government. Franz didn't expect this at first. He always felt that this Irish national hero should not do such a dirty thing, but after thinking about it, it was actually quite normal. After all, this was the reality. He betrayed his allies and what he wanted to save. Ireland is not in conflict. Fortunately, France had already made preparations. The affairs officers had entered through other channels, and it didn't matter if the priests' identities were exposed. Rather, the exposure would be more conducive to the next planned point in Belgium, 900 kilometers away from Ireland. The Flemish region of the Netherlands at this time. Potato late blight has begun to rage. The German customs union immediately issued an emergency decree banning the import of Dutch potatoes on the grounds that potato late blight may be contagious. This proposal was put forward by a small country that could not reach the 18th pole. The first one to respond was Prussia. After all, they competed with Dutch agricultural products. They banned Dutch potatoes from entering the German market. Frederick William IV would be happy to death. The Junkers nobles planned to celebrate with fireworks. The Austrian Empire issued an emergency order to reduce the proportion of potato planting. After all, Franz was not absolutely sure that this disaster would not affect Austria. Although this virus is serious, as long as you don't grow potatoes, you won't have this problem. However, this does not apply on the island of Ireland. This is not because potatoes can only be grown locally, but only potatoes can feed such a large population. There were only a very small number of Irish people like the Jennings who could rent 5 acres of land. Generally speaking, the land they rented would not exceed 3 acres, and in some areas it was even less than 1 acre. In fact, France also tried other high-yielding crops, but the year-round temperature in Ireland is too low and the sunshine duration is too short, making it only suitable for growing cool-loving crops, such as cassava, sweet potatoes and other potato crops that require greenhouses. Most of the cool-loving crops are vegetables, and the only ones that can be used as staple foods are wheat, potatoes, barley, highland barley, and sugar beets. France first took a fancy to sugar beets. After all, Austria had advanced sugar pressing technology. It seemed reasonable to let the Irish grow sugar beets and then use the money earned to buy food. However, the reality is that because cheap sugar from the Americas occupies the market, beet sugar does not have much market in the UK. The reason why those Scots and Welsh people grow sugar beets is because of state subsidies. There is no subsidy for the Irish to grow sugar beets. As second-class citizens, they are only allowed to grow food crops, so all that was left were wheat and barley. At this time, the yield of wheat per acre was really terrible. Coupled with the lack of fertilizers and scientific farming methods on the island of Ireland, it was really impossible to grow wheat on more than 10 acres of land to feed the whole family. In addition, the land of Irish farmers is generally relatively poor, and these lands are not suitable for wheat growth. 1 acre equals 6.07 acres. The yield of barley is much higher than that of wheat at this time, and the adaptability is also strong, but the taste is very poor, and the nutrients are not easily absorbed by the human body, and long-term consumption is prone to illness. Generally speaking, it is used to feed livestock or brew beer. Moreover, according to tradition, local landowners can let their animals eat the barley grown by farmers, which makes many farmers afraid of growing this crop. Just imagine that the food you have worked so hard to grow is directly eaten by those animals, but you are helpless and feel desperate. And because of corn law restrictions, the price of livestock sold into Britain has been rising. The great nobles and landowners had been considering the restoration of grazing. However, farmers and small farmers who had experienced the tragedy of sheep-eating people firmly resisted it, and large landowners had to slow down their actions. However, between 1820 and 1845, the land used for livestock production still quadrupled, accounting for 85% of the total agricultural land area. Chapter 589 Prophecy. Faced with the reality of rapidly decreasing land, they can only choose to accept it. Sadly, O'Connell told them to be patient, but all they got was an uncomplied law and increasingly frenzied plunder from the landowners. At present, France has no very effective solution. It seems that the only way is for the Irish to switch to other crops to reduce losses. However, this approach is obviously not recognized by the local people. After all, not everyone has enough courage to believe those predictions without warning. Point in the final analysis, although farmers are superstitious, they often prefer to believe their own experience rather than the words of these outsiders, even if they are sanctified under the cloak of religion. Point. And because of the entrustment of the sage from heaven, most of the empire's priests did not adopt a policy of cajoling. On the contrary, they signed an agreement with the peasants, but unfortunately only a few were willing to accept it. Point. Of course, the content of the agreement is quite beneficial to the bottom party. After all, Franz has no intention of profiting from it. Point. On the contrary, the priests who used the name of religion and prophecy were very successful, and they replaced potatoes with barley with just a few scares. These people combined the prophecies of the Doomsday Ark Society, a cult, with the late potato blight that appeared 2 years ago, and British conspiracy theories, to come up with a new prophecy. It's almost like a group of evil British people are developing an evil curse that can erode the soil. Only planting barley can drive out the evil. As a result, a new organization appeared in Ireland, the Barley Society, and an unlucky Austrian priest was recommended by the locals to become its spiritual leader. Superstition defeated science and reason in this way, leaving Franz speechless for a while. But even if farmers all over Ireland followed suit and switched to barley, the food they produced might not even be enough for food and clothing. After all, the land in their hands was too large, not enough. Point. The imperial priests only stocked up enough food in Ireland to get them through the first year. The best way was to make potatoes their staple food again, which was to eliminate the source of the famine, potato late blight. Point. In fact, due to Franz's instructions, these servants of God established some experimental bases on the island of Ireland and produced several pesticides of this era. Of course, there was also Bordeaux mixture used in later generations, but I don't know how effective it was at the same time. The priests and stewards sent by Austria were also describing a beautiful country and new lands to the Irish. Point. If there are a small number of immigrants, the empire's overseas colonies can absorb them, but if the number is too large, then issues of integration and security have to be considered. After all, Britain is very good at provoking internal conflicts in other countries, and its colonists are out of control. Famous for being extremely ferocious. Of course, diverting trouble eastward is also an option, such as encouraging the Irish to colonize southern Argentina, which was still Indian land at this time, or sending them to the Congo to let them fight the local indigenous people. Point. But after those Irish achievements, it was unclear whether Austria had a handle on their influence. Point. Even if it succeeds, there is a high probability that this method is used to make wedding dresses for the British, so sending them to Hungary or lands such as Dalmatia and California seems to be more in the interests of the empire. Point. Island of Ireland, Queen's Village. Point. Lightning and thunder accompanied by rain and snow. The weather was really terrible. Scathach Jennings closed the 2 wooden windows tightly, but the cold rain still seeped in, which made her mood worse. Point. The so-called windows are just 2 pieces of wood, because most people can't afford glass. I don't know if it was because he was punishing his brothers and sisters for secretly drinking wine. Father Cloven suddenly declared that the end of the world was coming and asked everyone to stop planting potatoes and plant barley instead. Point. Father Hans then calls his colleague crazy, but the former also advises everyone to stop growing potatoes because he has discovered a new way to turn 1 kilogram of barley into 3 kilograms of food. Point. It's just that Hans and his assistant Siegfried didn't bake the bread with barley flour, but steamed it. Point. That kind of round bread with a small piece of meat in the middle for decoration. My god. It seems so blasphemous. Like all in all, the men and boys were very happy, but there was strong opposition from the women of the village. Point. Although the priests were driven out by everyone, their sudden changes still made people in the village panic. Point. The father felt that the priests must have received some revelation, while the mother only felt that the former wanted to touch the big, round bread. After all, the latter's malnutrition and old age had made his physical condition no longer what it was before. Point. After hearing the conversation between the parents, Scathach's sister Irene ran into her arms and said with an arch, "There's nothing." Scathach reacted for a while before pinching Irene's face and saying, "You little guysachi, aren't you?" As the eldest brother, Patrit brought back a new friend, but to the disappointment of the family, it was another boy. Point. The family booed in disappointment, leaving Patrit angry and embarrassed. "Patrit, you are already a mature adult. You should think more about your lifelong affairs, Scathach. Jennings imitated his father and patted him meaningfully. This time it was Scathach who was pinched in the face. All the girls here are getting married in exchange for money. You guys are still cheating at home all day long to get food and drinks. When he came to visit for the first time, Wine seemed a little embarrassed. His body was thin and his face was dark. It was obvious at a glance that he was suffering from malnutrition. Wine's parents were exiled to New Zealand for theft and vagrancy. Fortunately, a distant uncle was willing to adopt him, saving him from the same fate as his biological parents. But perhaps it was a trick from God. His uncle, who had always been in good health, suddenly died of illness. Then he encountered a disaster that caused him to lose the land he received from his uncle. Fortunately, the comrades of Young Ireland helped him find a way to hide in Patrick's house. To be honest, Wine was fascinated by Scathach the first time they met. His innocent appearance, bright smile, and naughty personality all attracted him. But in the eyes of Scathach Jennings, he looked completely different. A dark-looking, silly-looking, weird guy who hung out with Patrick and liked to stare at people. Scathach, is this your friend? Why doesn't he speak? Patrick pressed his sister's head. Girl, please be nice. His uncle just passed away. Pete just passed away. Why don't you ask him to be polite to me? Pete is a pig. You said it was ugly and smelly all day long, and you ate more than anyone else that day. Patrick was speechless for his sister, but Scathach still spoke persistently. My poor Pete. But no matter how noisy the Jennings family was, Wine never said a word to anyone. However, Patrick's parents still received the child warmly. After all, these like-minded friends were more important to Patrick at this time than his family. Although the parents felt very angry, they still chose to be tolerant. However, Wine was not grateful, because the place where he slept was exactly Pete's nest. Chapter 590. The Liberians want to defy heaven. Port of Monrovia, West Africa. A British merchant ship sailed into this quiet harbor as usual. Liberia at this time was an American colony in West Africa. From 1821, the American Colonization Society established a black immigration area here, with the center in Monrovia. However, these black people from the United States do not show much difference, and the local infrastructure is still a mess. The economy mainly relies on selling timber and palm oil to the United States and other European countries to make profits. The black population in the United States is only about 15,000, and there are about 200,000 indigenous people in addition. Although it has developed for more than 20 years, the main achievement of the local people is to drive the indigenous tribes out of their land, and the economy and infrastructure are in a mess. The most terrible thing is that Liberia still needs to import food and weapons from abroad, but the weapons and food sold by the Americans to these free black people are not only of low quality, but also expensive. So the British discovered this business opportunity. Although it could only be regarded as a grasshopper's leg, it still had meat. In this way, the two countries were generally in peace. Until the first black governor of Liberia took office, Joseph Roberts, as an American African mixed race, did not feel that he was inferior to whites or Europeans, so he decided to tax the merchant ships of foreign powers. This naturally aroused dissatisfaction among the great powers. King Louis Philippe of France even stated in public that he would not pay taxes to slaves unless they hired a white tax collector. As a result, he found that he had underestimated the bottom line of Americans. For money, some white people actually worked as tax collectors for black people. But the French have to lose face, and France has no shortage of supply points in West Africa, so French merchant ships will choose to avoid this unlucky place. The Russian Tsar was even more violent, claiming that he would tear any black man to pieces if he dared set foot on a Russian ship. But in fact, Russian merchant ships usually did not leave the Black Sea in the past, and even now that trade with the Austrian Empire is open, they almost never leave the Mediterranean. But the British obviously don't believe in this evil. As a result, John Bull was warmly welcomed by the Black brothers. As soon as he got off the ship, Captain John Davis and his 20 crew members were forced to disembark by a group of black soldiers. The news soon spread to Europe and public opinion was in an uproar. Not many people on the European continent paid attention to the fact that British merchant ships did not pay taxes. People paid more attention to why those black people dared to detain British ships. Of course, this was deliberately guided by someone. As soon as France learned the news, he began to publicize the matter with great intensity, with the purpose of amplifying the incident. Other powers also understood this, and vowed to make this incident the trigger for the Third American-British War. The First American-British War refers to the American Revolutionary War, and the second refers to the War of 1812, when the White House was burned down, because Louis Philippe had lost face before. The French media was particularly crazy at this time, and even described it as a confrontation between black and white, a collision between barbarism and civilization. It's like if the British give in, they will commit seppuku every minute. The crazy campaign of the great powers seems to be in support of Britain, but in fact it is fanning the flames. Because Britain is too strong, everyone hopes to weaken it through war. In fact, whether it is setting fire to the White House for the second time, or bombarding London for the second time, the great powers can accept it. In short, it is very happy to watch dogs bite dogs on the island of Great Britain. People have different opinions. Some people think that not paying taxes is a mistake. The Whigs seized this opportunity to denounce the barbarism of the Tories. However, Robert Peel was not a mediocre person and quickly gathered a group of legal experts to start a debate with the Whigs. The British Navy responded immediately and intercepted one of the largest cargo ships in Liberia, naturally on the grounds that they were suspected of slave trading. In fact, the relationship between the black people in Liberia and the local black people is very poor, and they do not have much economic income, so they play some side projects. Normally the British would turn a blind eye, but at this time it was very gentlemanly not to sail the fleet directly into the port of Monrovia. Joseph Jenkins Roberts personally protested to the British government, but was mercilessly humiliated. After all, everyone on the European continent described this detention incident as a humiliation of the British by black people. The British Navy had never been so humiliated in so many years of fighting in the North and South. As the Commander-in-Chief of the West African Fleet, Henry Bergstein's nose was so angry that he would have thrown the black man in front of him into the sea to feed the sharks if several deputies had not stopped him. "Let your master talk to me." As a result, Joseph Jenkins Roberts only received this reply and was driven back to Liberia. In desperation, he could only ask the US government to intervene. James Knox Polk was quite tough. As soon as he got the news, he wrote a letter asking the British government to pay attention to the special interests of the United States in the colonial movement and to ask the United Kingdom to recognize the sovereignty of Liberia. Robert Peel responded immediately, "In response to your request, the UK government cannot treat a commercial entity established by a charity as a sovereign state. Just like your country did with OMD in California. Therefore Britain was not required to abide by Liberian laws at this time." The words of the British guy can be described as murderous, because if the Americans forcefully demand that the United Kingdom abide by the laws of Liberia, it will be equivalent to admitting that it was not Mexico, but Austria that they invaded in the US-Mexico War. Invading Mexico and invading Austria are completely different concepts. Although the United States and Austria are thousands of miles apart, Austria can use this excuse to declare war on the United States at any time, and can even call on other powers. On the contrary, when the United States conflicts with other powers, Austria can also use this excuse to intervene. The result of offending one power in person is really terrible, but what about offending two at the same time? Even a tough president like Polk had to consider the consequences of this matter, but he is worthy of being the toughest president in the United States. Faced with the British attack, he did not panic at all, and chose a strategy of damaging 1,000 to himself and 8 to the enemy. Polk immediately launched a bill to promote Liberia's independence. Finally, at the president's insistence, the American Colonization Society's board of directors announced, "At this time, it is appropriate to transfer all powers of self-government, including the power to handle foreign relations, into the hands of the people of Liberia." As a result, Liberia became independent, and the British theoretically had to pay tariffs, and they could no longer use this reason to continue to humiliate Polk and threaten the United States. But just as the United States recognized Liberia's independence, Britain established diplomatic relations with the latter, which made Polk feel like he was being cowed. In Fact, Liberia borders the British colony of Lion Rock, which the British have long coveted, and the Liberian people are also very currently aware and willing to accept the leadership of the British Empire. Chapter 591 The Horror of Sugar-Coated Bullets. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz had to admit the sophistication of the British, and at the same time he was reviewing his bad habit of relying too much on the experience of later generations, because in his memory, Liberia has always been an independent country. Although its economic development is in a mess, it is a non-aligned country. In fact, I was misled by some short videos, thinking that Liberia has always been so tough. Liberia's choice to ally with the British would directly threaten the security of Austrian Guinea. In fact, in addition to Austria, there are also French, Spanish and Portuguese forces in Guinea. Although the Liberians have received support from the British, there is no need to worry too much, because this country is still too weak to stretch its hands too far. At least the local indigenous people must be dealt with before they can consider moving further north or east. The Austrian Empire was the largest colonial force in Guinea at this time, with more than 4,000 people, but it was the worst of all Austrian colonies. One reason is that there are too many countries that have come to colonize here, and the other reason is that the strong influence of the Tire Order has made the local chiefs reject and avoid the Austrian Empire. In addition, Guinea at that time was also considered a country lacking mineral resources. Gold and diamonds had not yet been discovered, and the tropical rainforest also prevented further exploration by colonists. After all, the interior of Africa was still a death zone for ordinary white people at this time. As a result, the Austrian colonists could only carry out hopeless reclamation activities without the help of local people. Although they signed land treaties with countless tribes in 5 years, the actual territory they controlled was less than 20% of their sphere of influence. Franz knew that in order for Guinea to truly develop, it was necessary to contact the Tire Order. Whether the two parties reached an agreement or completely eliminated it, the problem of colonial development could be solved. However, with the medical level at this time, Franz did not think it was necessary for Austria to go deep into the interior of Africa to annihilate a feudal kingdom. After all, this would not be worth the gain. So there is only the first way to choose, and that is negotiation. Whether it is a promise of protection, cheap industrial products, or using gold as a bribe. At this time, Guinea was most lacking in manpower. Franz knew very well that, as long as the colony developed, he would be able to regain what he had lost in a few decades or even a few years. In fact, Franz had already sent people to Bolivia to collect the seeds of the cinchona tree and planted them extensively in Chinla and Kalimantan. Historically, it is the legend that quinine helped African colonists defeat the white man's grave. The African interior was once known as the white man's graveyard. Although quinine was introduced to Europe as early as the 17th century, Europeans did not realize quinine freedom until the mid-19th century. It was not until the British introduced the cinchona tree to India in 1860 that Europeans finally had stable access to this anti-malarial drug. 10 years later, it was precisely because of this premise that Europeans were able to start the wave of colonial partition in the 1870s. But this time, France had started experiments on planting cinchona trees in the warm and humid rainforests of Southeast Asia as early as 1836. He believed that it would not be long before he could get rid of his dependence on quinine from countries such as Brazil. At this time, quinine in Brazil cost nearly £100 per kilogram, which was beyond the reach of ordinary people, and just like rubber, it was often out of stock. Without rubber, the Austrian Empire would have to stop production, reduce production, and reform technology, but without quinine, people would die. Although Artemisia annua and turtle soup can be used as a substitute, France is not prepared to put the backup solution into use prematurely. After all, malaria drug resistance is a major issue concerning all mankind. Back to the main story. France actually has someone who can negotiate with the Tire Order, and that is the Caramanli family, who have been raised in Tripoli by the Austrian Empire. After the Near East crisis ended, the Caramanli family returned to Tripoli with the help of Friedrich, and those who helped them get started were the craftsmen rescued by Austria from Egypt. This group of people has a very high degree of loyalty to the Austrian Empire, and the reason why the Caramanli family can gain a foothold in Tripoli is because of the protection of Austria, so the United Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire will turn a blind eye to them. I point at this time, when Franz made his request, the leader of the Caramanli family immediately agreed. The negotiation process went very smoothly, and both parties quickly reached an agreement. The Tyre order is actually very poor. They lack everything. Weapons, clothes, food, salt, sugar, and tools can all be traded, and they only have human power, animal skins, and ivory. The Tyre order, like other Arabs, attaches great importance to business, and has no sense of guilt in trading with any pagans. The reason why they were hostile to the Austrians and refused to communicate with them before was actually because they were frightened and deceived by the Portuguese. Although the number of Portuguese colonists was only 500, they were overwhelming to the Tyre order, which was still in the early Middle Ages. In the past, the Portuguese, French, and Spanish regarded them as slaves, often cheating in transactions, and even directly snatching them by force. Therefore, the Tyre order placed great trust in Austria, an honest and reliable business partner. After all, their asking price was very low, and Franz was not prepared to engage in a slave economy in Africa. He had no control over what other countries did. With the help of these locals, the colonial development speed of the Austrian Empire will be greatly improved. As for when other countries want to poach others, they will find that Franz has kept the price of goods very low. He is not prepared to play short-term arbitrage tricks. What Franz wanted was an economy dependent on the Austrian Empire, except that the labor in this economy was very cheap. Moreover, the first thing the Tyre order did, after receiving the support of Franz, was to conquer those weak tribes, to increase its own strength, and at the same time, began to try to expel the colonial forces among them. Portugal and the tribes that relied on it suffered the most serious losses. However, given Portugal's poor strength at this time, it had no plans to retaliate. The Portuguese governor here was a smart man. He quickly found the person in charge of the Austrian Empire in Guinea, and finally the two parties finalized an agreement to sell the colony for £5,000. Of course, the Austrian side needs to help the captured Portuguese. Although the bottom level of the Tyre order is fiercely opposed, the top brass are well aware of their dilemma. In fact, during the transactions with the Austrian Empire, some of the top leaders of the Tyre order began to be corrupted. They even began to secretly convert to the Catholic Church, and those Portuguese Christians were their certificates of surrender. Franz was surprised by the conversion efficiency of the Austrian Church, but Archbishop Prussia said that the senior leaders of the Tyre order took the initiative to request conversion, and he did not send anyone to contact them. Ever since, Franz could only lament the horror of sugar-coated bullets. Chapter 590. To the Tsar's surprise, France, Paris. The French Ministry of Transport was stimulated by representatives of the small German states at the recent aftermath meeting of the Alsace-Lorraine incident. At this time, in order to regain its position, the Minister of Transport proposed a package of radical reform measures, including a series of railway construction projects and the establishment of new train research and modification projects. On the one hand, a group of officials are red-faced because the interest groups behind them are fighting for the right to build and operate the railway. On the other hand, there is a large number of people who have jumped out to oppose the so-called train research center. The reason for the latter is simply that they do not want to see money wasted on railway and train improvement projects, because the cost of imported technology from Britain across the channel is less than 1/10 of independent research and development. Since there are ready-made results that can be enjoyed at a low price, why should we pay a high price to reopen a road that others have already traveled? What's the point of doing this? While the Minister of Transport was engaged in a war of words with a group of opponents, someone else jumped out to report that an academician of the French Academy of Sciences had taken bribes and deliberately slowed down the research process. Immediately the nature of the question changed from whether to establish a train research project to whether the Transport Secretary had accepted a bribe. Of course, to be fair, Human beings, no matter their origin or skin color, can always find shortcomings in them. After a series of inquiries and the brainstorming of various officials, the evil intentions of the Minister of Transport were finally discovered. The minister's distant relative is a mechanical engineer who just lost his job recently, so it can be concluded from his behavior that this is completely false for public benefit. As a result, the Minister of Transport had to take the blame and resign, and the plan to establish the French Train Research Center also collapsed. Regarding this gluttonous feast of railway engineering projects, the final winner was naturally James Mere Rothschild for only one reason: he had money. Even if the Rothschild family does not want to participate in the carving up of the French railway, the family will still get this opportunity in the end. This is the charm of capital. The second biggest winners are those bureaucratic financiers, the so-called Orleans faction. Although the routes obtained by these people are not many, they are all expensive. Because they are all prime routes, the remaining short and remote sections are openly carved up by the public. However, the French soon realized a problem: they lacked funds. Even James Mere Rothschild was the same point, and it happened that Louis Philippe announced the establishment of the Texas Railroad Company to the outside world at this time, openly backstabbing his subjects and supporters. Although the investment for the Texas Railway will be greater, it is not difficult to build in the plains, and because it is located in the North American colonies, it has huge potential, so the overall return is the highest point. But here comes the problem, that is, although the Orleans royal family is rich, their loan may not be able to afford such a huge construction cost, unless they are leaking plans to sell off his family's real estate. Just when this news was spread by the Paris financial circles, His Majesty the King's approach once again shocked people. Yes, he planned to use public funds to build the railway and then enjoy the benefits himself. Louis Philippe's actions were not unexpected. After all, His Majesty the King was not clever at all. Austria was also involved in the French railway craze this time, but Franz just used someone else's vest. As for the contracted railways, which were typically remote and short in distance, Franz was not interested in these lines because he knew about their future development and found business opportunities in them. He knew very well that the spring of nations started with the collapse of the King of Orleans, so these lines had no value at all, and it was impossible to recover the cost. But the routes he contracted all had a common feature, that is, they were connected to the border with Fassa, France, Sardinia. France's purpose could not be simpler, which is to delay the French advance into Italy. Given the long and narrow coastline of Italy, the French could easily open a sea passage to the Apennine Peninsula. But that's another story, and the sea is full of uncertainty. This factor is likely to be fatal when two great powers compete. The British also did something similar. Lionel Rothschild had a secret conversation with his uncle. The two of them finalized the ownership of several important railways while drinking and drinking. As for the debate in the French Congress, it's just a show. Robert Peel even approved a special sum of money in order to be able to inflict trouble on the French. But what he didn't expect was that the July dynasty would be gone before these railways were completed. When the distant St. Petersburg heard the rumors, the partition was already at its peak. By the time the apostles arrived in Paris, everything had already settled, and they just regarded it as a trip at public expense. Of course, this was actually a preview of a visit that Tsar Nicholas I was planning to surprise the world. Then Queen Victoria in Windsor Castle was frightened. Victoria's lady-in-waiting informed her of the Tsar's upcoming visit on April 1st, 1845. But the latter did not take it seriously and regarded it as a crude joke. At this time, the 26-year-old Victoria was as young as a wolf and a tiger, and she was ready to contribute more heirs to the British Empire. This naturally required the help of Prince Albert, but the latter seemed a little powerless. After all, it was enough for him to deal with the overt and covert struggles between the Whigs and Tories, as well as the turbulent international situation. When I got home, I had to deal with 4 children. After finally driving away the group of little devils, the big devil found me again. Victoria was a careful woman who paid attention to her husband's every move. Although Prince Albert did not cheat, the Queen would not accept the fact that he had lost interest in her, so she began to look for ways to change this situation. From gorgeous clothes and jewelry to expensive perfumes, and even playing polo with Albert. After trying all the above methods, The alienation between the two has still not been alleviated, especially when Prince Albert unabashedly criticized the behavior of his pig teammates when playing polo. You must know that this prince is known for his good temper and the image of a good man. Whether in the outside world or in private, he rarely behaves rudely or unethically, let alone towards women. However, playing polo with Victoria was simply a torture. Prince Albert originally broke through all the way and saw the goal within easy reach. At this time, the former suddenly shouted to the latter to wait. This was nothing at all. The female knight was relatively weak and had not shot much. It was understandable that she wanted to experience it. But Victoria is not here to attack, she just wants to be romantic. Originally, this kind of thing was not uncommon on the polo field, and the British in this era were still very gentlemanly, especially when the other party was the queen and the prince's husband. It's just that Victoria's thoughts are completely different from Albert's. The former doesn't want it to end right away and is ready to kiss for a while longer. This made everyone present very embarrassed. As time went by, some energetic young people couldn't help but take the opportunity to steal the polo. This happened again and again, and finally, during a close exchange, the two sides almost fell off their horses. Albert could no longer bear it and began to accuse Her Majesty of the Queen of being unreasonable. Prince Albert was as irritable as a primary school student who had lost 10 qualifying games in a row. He criticized Queen Victoria's skills, behavior, and even character in all aspects. The latter obviously did not think that he was at fault. Instead, he felt that he had condescended to him in order to bring the relationship closer between husband and wife. He was so aggrieved that he yelled, "You are heartless. You are cold. You are unreasonable. Am I heartless? Am I cold? Am I unreasonable? Yes. You are ruthless. You are cold. You are unreasonable. Then, you are not heartless, not cold, not unreasonable. Where am I heartless? Where am I cold? Where am I unreasonable? Where are you not ruthless? Where are you not cold? Where are you not unreasonable? No matter how ruthless I am, no matter how cruel, no matter how unreasonable I am, I will never be more ruthless than you. More ruthless. Even more unreasonable. At least I won't hold hands and form a human wall when playing polo defense. Fuck polo. Fuck defense." Victoria angrily swung her riding crop and left the court. The discord between the queen and her husband was not a trivial matter. Naturally, the nobles present were not in the mood to play ball. After all, the queen is gone. Why not play ball? Victoria rode angrily all the way back to her castle, but after thinking about it, she felt that she was wrong, especially in public. This kind of gaffe was terrible. But soon her thoughts returned to her husband. After all, the old guys in the government didn't seem to like her being too active in political affairs at this time. Victoria suddenly remembered the medicine that the Indian businessman named Verwise had paid tribute to. On the other hand, Prince Albert calmed down before Victoria. After all, his political sensitivity was much higher, so Prince Albert lied that everything just happened was just an April Fool's Day joke. He realizes his own problems and perhaps should fulfill his obligations as a husband. Prince Albert returned to Windsor Castle in a slightly apologetic mood, and Victoria was ready for everything. The two had dinner as usual and drank some wine, and then Prince Albert dismissed the servants. "I'm sorry for my gaffe today, but I just want to tell you that your safety and health are more important than my life." The misunderstanding between the two people was quickly solved, and then they exchanged their heart-to-hearts, peeled off the cocoons, and had a fierce battle. When the two were reaching a critical moment, there was a knock on the door of the room. The Russian Tsar Nicholasai has arrived. Please invite Her Majesty the Queen. Before the maid could finish her words, she was rudely interrupted by Victoria. "Mary, if you tell me that bad joke, I'll make you a stable boy tomorrow." "Maid," Mary said, "Your Majesty, don't be like this. But Nicholasai is really here. If you don't believe me, look out the window." Victoria and Albert slowly moved to the window, and through the folding pages they saw that a delegation had arrived at Windsor Castle. Oh my god. The two quickly got dressed, but formal clothes in this era were not so easy to wear. Victoria had to pull her maid Mary into the room to help. The latter showed embarrassment when she and Prince Albert looked at each other, but it passed away. The Queen was not mentally prepared for the Russian Tsar's sudden visit without warning. After all, Nicholas was not here for his own government this time, but intended to establish a personal relationship between monarchs. The Tsar paid great attention to this, but Prime Minister Robert Peel didn't care at all. After all, he hated the Queen, and the Queen hated him. He was only responsible to the parliamentary gentlemen in Westminster. In fact, Nicholas I was supposed to visit Britain in 1844, but that visit failed to take place because Russia chose to side with Austria in the Luxembourg crisis. This time the Tsar came again uninvited, which was why Victoria was so caught off guard. Nicholas I's brother, Tsar Alexander I, was Queen Victoria's godfather. So the two were not too unfamiliar. It's just that this kind of diplomatic behavior makes Victoria very uncomfortable. After all, she is not a traditional monarch. Prince Albert, however, did not have much respect for the tall Tsar because he felt that the latter's rule lacked art, and he did not like his reputation for cruelty. What Prince Albert looked down upon the most was Nicholas I's seemingly polite attitude at this time. Bullying the weak and fearing the strong was the former's evaluation of the latter. Although Tsar Nicholas I has always emphasized the power of the Tsar and is known for his toughness, Russia has been avoiding direct differences with Britain over the years and even hid behind Austria, a more feudal and backward country. Nicholas I didn't like this little man who kept staring at him, especially since the latter's lower body was obviously uncomfortable. And the former despised Lord Longyang extremely. Prince Albert is 178 cm tall. Historically, there are two records of Nicholas I's height. One is 190 cm and the other is 206 cm. The previous version was written as 190 cm, and this one is written as 206 cm. After a brief embarrassment, the Tsar revealed his purpose. Osman is a dead man, but he is not dead yet. He deserves to die, and we should make sure that he dies. I think you understand what I mean. Her Majesty, Victoria, was shocked by the other party's diplomatic style. Whether it was what she had learned in Germany or what she had seen and heard in the UK, this was the first time she had experienced talking about things like this, but she quickly came to her senses and responded, "I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what you mean, and I think you are talking to the wrong person. You should talk to the politicians in our country, not me, my dear Tsar." Nicholas I, no. I insist on talking to those chosen by God, not those who steal the monarchy. As long as Britain and Russia join forces, the Ottomans will be ours. Your achievements will be comparable to Queen Elizabeth I. Ahem. Prince Albert interrupted Nicholas I don't think so. The greatness of the British Empire is that it has found a balance between democracy and autocracy. It can better reflect public opinion and avoid abuse of power. At this time, we do not want to destroy this balance. After hearing this, Nicholas I immediately became serious. He did not want democracy, let alone listen to the so-called bullshit public opinion. Is this your answer, Prince? Albert also had a tough attitude. No, we don't have the power. Please go talk to the gentlemen of the cabinet. Chapter 593. La actress and cook. News of Tsar Nicholas I's visit to England soon spread throughout Europe, and as expected, caused an uproar. This is especially a heavy blow to France, a country that is preparing to encircle Austria. After all, Britain and Russia do not just want Europe when they join forces, but they want to carve up the world. Louis Philippe couldn't bear this, but when he turned around, he realized that France seemed to have Spain as its only half-dead ally. Fortunately, the German Confederation responded quickly and disregarded past grudges. The two sides quickly started consultations and reached consensus on some issues. The small princes of the German Confederation were afraid of France, but they were even more afraid of Russia because they knew that Louis Philippe just wanted to destroy their country, while the Tsar would do it more thoroughly. Prussia was the first to bear the brunt of Russia's westward advance, while Austria had its own considerations. After all, being a Russian ally was not an easy thing to accept. The Tsar's behavior was to blatantly regard Austria as a spare tire. His words such as Britain and Russia join forces and there will be no obstacles in the world are completely like a licking dog confessing to a goddess. As for why these details were leaked, it was naturally the work of the British. In terms of political skills and diplomacy, the Tsar was not worthy of being an apprentice. Austria is not weak in diplomacy. After all, Prime Minister Metternich is a skilled diplomat, and he is not as excited as the people. On the contrary, he is calm and feels normal, not to mention that he has any hurt feelings, but he understood that he must take action at this time to fight back against Russia's betrayal, and at the same time, make early plans for the worst possible scenario. British and Russian forces joining forces. France is a good ally. After all, the prestige of the Napoleonic era has not dissipated. No country in Europe dares to underestimate France, not even Austria, which defeated it twice. Franz was accustomed to Russia's sudden diplomatic approach, but he was not worried at all about the possible alliance between Britain and Russia or what impact it would have. After all, Franz knew very well that one mountain cannot tolerate two tigers. It is impossible for two countries that both want to compete for world hegemony to achieve real peace. In the subsequent Crimean War, the two countries were the protagonists of their respective camps. As for the alliance with France, Franz didn't take it seriously. After all, there was a lot of friction between France and Austria at this time, especially the issues of Italy, Germany, West Africa, and North America, which were almost irreconcilable. However, this does not prevent the two countries from joining forces to protect themselves. But 1848 is approaching, and the Orleans dynasty may be wiped out in an instant. After all, France has no less internal conflicts than Austria. The financiers have almost hollowed out the country, and the royal family is like a parasite sucking the last marrow of the country. The peasants were poor and miserable. The workers were living in dire straits. The social status of the soldiers was extremely low, referring to soldiers and non-commissioned officers, and the colonies were also full of contradictions. The seemingly incomparably powerful giant was tense, and would be completely knocked down if it collapsed in one place. Of course, Prince Metternich's actions are blameless, but his actions may slightly hurt the self-esteem of Nicholas I, a traditional monarch. The situation in the Austrian Empire was special. Although the monarch was Ferdinand I, the decision was made by the Regency Council. Therefore, the Tsar should not be jealous of the Habsburg family, but should be jealous of those thieves he called. In fact, after the Tsar's operation, there is still good news for Austria. That is, the Ottomans are even more at a loss. Sultan Mejid, once a civilized man from the east in the eyes of the Western media, was already bowed down by things at home and abroad, and his body was hollowed out by wine and sex. In order to continue to satisfy his desires, he had to start taking opium to enhance his vitality. Also, in order to continue the Ottoman Empire, he chose to extend an olive branch to Austria, his old enemy. On the one hand, this situation occurred because Austria had maintained a strong influence and a relatively strong posture in several previous crises, which left a deep impression on Majid. On the other hand, Osman really has no friends at this time. Persia is too weak, and the Oman Empire cannot quench its thirst from far away. Historically, the Oman Empire was considered a very powerful existence before the collapse of the Sayyid dynasty, and even Britain and France did not dare to insult it lightly. The tragic defeat of the Omani navy at the hands of the Austrian navy in the book did not spread too widely. On the contrary, it was said's large-scale purchase of warships from Europe that made it to the hot search list at the time. Of course, Said bought this popularity himself in order to deter those who might underestimate the Oman Empire. After all, the battle with the Austrian navy shocked him too much. Said had always believed that, except Britain and the Ottomans, no country could defeat its own navy. The subsequent war with the Austrian Empire, a country he had never heard of, left him with too tragic a memory. The once arrogant Omani navy took the lead in launching a surprise attack with several times its strength, but was hung up and beaten. This was really terrifying. However, Said was not heartbroken at that time, and it was not until Friedrich visited Zanzibar for the second time that he truly gave in, when he gave his most precious daughter as a gift. At this time, Said sneered at Megid's proposal to join forces. He did not want to ruin his country, and the fear of European powers was deeply ingrained in his bones. After eliminating the two options of Persia and Oman, He was left with only 3 options: Egypt, France, and Austria. Egypt had been completely defeated by the last Near East crisis, and France was considered by Majid to be an unreliable ally. In the end, only Austria was left, which had been at war with the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. The latter had good credibility and strength, and most importantly, it did not want to get involved in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire. Majid's bottom line is Istanbul and the Anatolian Plateau. He does not care about other pagan territories. At present, Austria does not seem to conflict with the core interests of the Ottomans, and those pagan territories can be used as bargaining chips to win over Austria. In fact, Majid was eager to give the 2 Danube principalities to Austria, and then watch them fight to the death with Russia. It's just that such an obvious alienation plan is difficult to succeed. Fortunately, he does not lack chips. Between 1840 and 1845, dozens of riots involving more than 1,000 people occurred in the Eastern European part of the Ottoman Empire. This greatly consumed Majid's energy and the financial resources of the treasury, and also forced it to rely more on the army. For Majid personally, those are not Ottoman Empire territories, but cancers in the brain. Without those territories in Eastern Europe, the Russians might not make plans of their own anymore. In fact, this was not just Majid's idea. A group of Ottoman senior officials thought so, and even formed a faction. This idea also deeply influenced the later generations of Turkey's founding father, General Kemal. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 594. Do something practical. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz quite liked this situation. Although it seemed tense, it was actually testing and bluffing. But he wasn't going to play a frivolous game with these people. Franz was going to do something real. He prepared a large gift for both Majid and Nicholas I at the same time. Cunning in London shouted foolish. Cunning had been the British ambassador to the Ottomans before becoming Under Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and even Majid had a nominal master-apprentice relationship. But the former never expected that the Sultan he carefully selected would actually contact the Austrian Empire and do such a stupid thing. In fact, the reason why the Ottomans sent envoys to contact the Austrian Empire was because, on the one hand, Britain did not do a good job of exchanging intelligence with its allies, and on the other hand, the things the world's #1 troublemaker always did made people feel uncomfortable. A sense of distrust. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was experiencing constant internal and external troubles. Although it had been changed, but not completely changed, Majid, the leader of the reform, was not a human being inside and out. The reformers believed that he was cowardly and incompetent, while the conservatives believed that he had betrayed his own class. In addition, the sect often leads its members to cause trouble, dealing with Jews today, Armenians tomorrow, and heretical sects the day after tomorrow. Almost all the great powers in the world wanted to cut off a piece of flesh from the Ottoman Empire. The French took away Algeria and Morocco, the Austrians took away Tripoli, the British took away Egypt, and Russia took away too many lands to mention. Tripoli is still nominally Ottoman territory, but the governor appointed by Majid has been expelled. The actual rulers are the Karamanli family, and the boss behind them is Austria. The worst news at this time is that Britain and Russia may join forces, so Majid has to prepare an alternative. There is another thing that gives him a headache at home, and that is local uprisings, especially in Albania. The reforms carried out by Majid are also called Tanzimat reforms, and many of the principles are very good. For example, centralization was established to replace the feudal system, and national financial institutions were established to replace the decadent Iltachum system. Abolish the feudal military armed forces of the past, establish a universal compulsory military service system, organize and train new armies, etc. But these reforms changed completely when they reached the local level. They became a money-making tool for pashas and bureaucrats, and they did not touch the source of corruption. At the same time that feudal ownership was abolished, Albania's landowners expanded rapidly, and after local disarmament was disarmed, they became true local overlords with complete control over taxation, law, and security. These landowners were both bureaucrats and capitalists, driving peasants who had abolished feudal obligations from their lands with absolutely no restraints. The fate of the mountain people is also miserable. Although their land officials look down upon them, there are always ways to make money. Officials cleverly created a name for the mountain people, not only to pay blood tax, but also to bear taxes that they did not have to bear before, such as livestock tax. The cattle tax was a poll tax imposed by the Ottoman Empire on Christians, but traditionally mountain people were exempt from other taxes, as long as they paid the blood tax. However, after the reform, the mountain residents could not get any money for paying the blood tax, and various other heavy burdens made them overwhelmed. Unlike those farmers in the plains who just cry and fight for the land and starve to death, many of the mountain people are military households for generations. They do not lack fighting skills or courage. At the same time, because mountainous areas are relatively backward, many areas still implement the system of patriarchs or imams. These patriarchs and imams have very exaggerated influence. They can even call on the people to rise up and directly fight against the country. 3 Armed uprisings involving tens of thousands of people occurred in Kosovo in 1843, in Gjegjela in 1844, and in Tuscalia in 1845. The mountain people and the peasants who had lost their land joined forces to rob and kill the big landowners who were officials. At first, under the leadership of the patriarchs and imams, the rebel troops attacked local officials, but as the scale of the uprising expanded and casualties continued to increase, after all, those big landowners had private armed forces, and the targets of the former were no longer limited to those landowners and officials with bad reputations. The rebel army would storm into the homes of anyone who had a house to live in, lynching the men, taking away the women, and looting all the belongings. Another version of local events reached Majid's ears. That is, some people opposed the reform and massacred progressive people who supported the reform, and even massacred innocent people. What makes people even more angry is that people who have converted to the Cheyenne Fang sect actually collude with those Christians. It is really despicable to the extreme, and is simply intolerable. Majid also sent people to suppress it at first, but the combat effectiveness of the new Ottoman army was really limited, and if you want to project force to local areas, you need tax and manpower support. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was filled with public dissatisfaction due to reforms and uprisings everywhere, and it could not afford the cost of an expedition. So Majid could only order local officials and landowners to raise their own military salaries and train rural warriors to fight against the rebels. This method actually once again acquiesced to the feudal power of the big landowners, and even made it possible for them to go further, that is, to become a separatist vassal town. This strong dose of medicine really worked. The local area immediately mobilized a lot of armed forces and beat the rebels back steadily. Majid even ordered a reward for this, but soon he discovered something was wrong. That is, it seemed that these rebels could never be wiped out. Seeing the local power growing day by day, Majid realized that he was drinking poison to quench his thirst. But at this time it was too late to think about breaking the strong man's wrist, and the whole of Albania became a sore on the Ottoman Empire. In fact, it can also be described as a tentacle of corruption that cannot be cut off. It will only continue to erode the soul of the Ottoman Empire. But Franz is going to give Majid a gift, which is a sword that can cut off this tentacle. Austria could help deal with the rebellious mountaineers in the north and eliminate any separatist forces that might be disloyal to the Sultan. Majid was extremely excited when he heard the Austrian envoy's proposal. Although Albania was not a wealthy land, it was still an important food producing area in the Ottoman Empire, and before the rebellion, it could contribute to the country at least once a year 2 million lire. The Ottoman lira was a very unstable currency, trading almost 30 to 1 against the British pound, but it rapidly depreciated under Majid's reforms. At this time, the Ottoman Empire's annual income was only 150 million Ottoman lire, which was not as much as a coastal province of the Austrian Empire. So, what's the price? Majid knew very well that such favorable conditions must be accompanied by huge benefits, otherwise no one would take the initiative to take over this mess. In fact, Majid even considered selling this province to Austria. After all, instead of letting it rot in his hands and disgusting himself, it would be better to sell it and stop the loss. Chapter 595 Two Gifts. Austria did not dare to buy the entire Albania blatantly. After all, Russia regarded the place where these Slavs lived as its own taboo point. In order to take care of the Russians' emotions, Austria must find a reasonable reason. For example, the Ottomans are a good person to take the blame point. Of course, if the Tsar had not insisted on finding trouble, Franz would have postponed this plan for a few years. After all, it was too close to 1848, and the most sensible approach for Austria would be to adopt a comprehensive contraction strategy. It's just that how can everything go as planned, and Russia is a country that is easy to push beyond its limits. So Franz's plan seemed correct and necessary at this time. His conditions were not harsh. Austria would manage the northern mountainous area for the Ottoman Empire, and at the same time lease the port of Sinjini, a port in northern Albania, to transport troops and supplies. As for the warlords in the southern plains, the Austrian side will also try its best to fight against them in accordance with the requirements of the Ottoman Empire. However, casualties are unavoidable in battle, so the latter must provide sufficient evidence to prove that those are rebels, and at the same time, cannot pursue accidental injuries and looting that may occur during the battle. Afterwards, Austria will pay 1 million Ottoman lira to the Ottoman Empire to replace the taxes on the northern mountainous areas, and the southern part will be returned to the latter. After all, the plain areas are relatively easy to rule. In fact, both the north and east of Albania are mainly mountainous, but the north is mainly Catholic, the east is Orthodox Christian, and the southwest is heavenly Christian. At this time, there were more than 1.3 million people in Albania, including more than 100,000 Catholics and more than 300,000 Orthodox Christians, and the rest were all Shi and Fang Christians. A certain country in ancient times also called Arabia heaven, hence the Arabian Nights story. Franz will definitely choose those who are easy to assimilate, and at the same time, he will also find a window for the Montenegrins and Croatians to vent, so as to prevent them from fighting among themselves without external enemies. Franz's actions received the full support of the church. In their view, this was a good deed comparable to the Crusades, in expelling paganism and saving Christians at the same time. Looking at the Austrian side from Majid's perspective is too sincere. After all, even in normal times, northern Albania would not be able to hand over as much as 1 million Ottoman liras. Returning the prosperous and developed southern region to the Ottoman government was undoubtedly an act to extend its life. As for accidental injury and looting, Majid regarded them as completely reasonable punishments. He was also afraid that the Austrians did not kill enough and robbed harshly enough. After all, only the weaker the local forces are, the stronger his centralized power will be, and the local areas are all Slavs. If the Austrians really go on a killing spree, Russia will not sit idly by and ignore it. In this way, the Ottomans and Austria can be regarded as brothers in trouble. In fact, Austria's asking price was far lower than Majid's expectations. In the latter's eyes, the Western powers were greedy and shameless robbers, and they were never relenting in seizing Ottoman territory. On the contrary, this is the first time he has seen a civilized bandit like Franz. After all, as long as it does not threaten his core interest group, the conquered land can be abandoned. To be honest, Franz actually has no interest in the Balkans. After all, the ethnic and religious composition of this place is too complex, and it can become a powder keg if he is not careful. Of course, there are ways to dismantle even at Inderbarks, such as using the power of religion to unite some local people and then help them earn their own living space. In this way, these oppressed people at the bottom will regard the Austrian Empire as their savior, thus establishing faith in the empire. Then we started to improve the lives of local people and spread Austrian culture, spirit, customs, and habits. Soon these people will find out what kind of life they have lived in the past. When they begin to despise tradition, it means breaking with the original world. At this time, they become the true supporters of the Austrian Empire. As for the heretics living in the fertile lands, they are obviously enemies of God and obstacles to the empire. They, the devout believers, should eliminate those pests. On the other hand, mountains are both obstacles and barriers. The Austrian side, that occupies the mountains, is always in a favorable offensive position. On the contrary, the Ottomans, who have lost the protection of the barrier, will be just a dish on the table sooner or later. Magid's deal with Austria would have made Tsar Nicholas I furious, but Franz would not forget Russia while giving gifts to the Ottomans. In fact, as soon as the Tsar returned to St. Petersburg, and before he had time to check the performance of the Crown Prince, an urgent report came from the border. The Chechen rebel army led by Imam Shami once again defeated the main Russian force, and also robbed a large amount of war supplies sent by the Austrian Empire. This batch of supplies includes a large number of light artillery suitable for mountain warfare, as well as new rockets specially used for sieges. In addition, there are also a large number of new rifles and ammunition. Although these are all obsolete products from Austria, they are still very attractive to Russia. After the Russians decided on the quantity, the former loaded the goods on the ship, but it was delayed for some time due to some things, and the trading location was temporarily changed. The new trading location is closer to the Caucasus, and also closer to the Russian military camp. The Austrian side's reason was to deliver the goods to their door, but there were unforeseen circumstances and people had misfortune. The Russians had just finished unloading the goods, and were attacked by Imam Shami's rebel army. Before they could put them into the warehouse, the unprepared Russian army was killed by the Chechen army. Afterwards, Shami continued his usual style of executing all Russians. The Russian army lost more than 8,600 men in this battle, and also lost about 20,000 Austrian equipment. With this equipment, Shami could raise a few more teams. Imam Shami is a national hero of Chechnya and the protagonist of the entire Caucasus War. He is very good at defeating the strong with the weak, and has achieved many brilliant victories against the Russian army, even putting the Russians on the defensive for a long period of time. Shami implemented many reforms, hoping to completely dismantle the feudal system and patriarchal system in the Caucasus and establish a Xianfang religion state with a 3-in-1 military, political, and religious system. He led the rebel army to attack noble landowners, liberated serfs and slaves, and distributed the land and wealth of the landowners to them. Actually, serfs are not equal to slaves. At that time, there were still remnants of slavery in some areas of the Caucasus. At the same time, people were appointed on their merits, whether they were slaves, old nobles, or craftsmen. As long as they were talented, they would be given important official positions. Customary laws were abolished, a new code of laws was established, and the country was governed according to law to a certain extent. Reform agriculture and encourage the development of industry and commerce. It's just that the Caucasus region is still too small compared to the huge Russia. In the end, Shami was defeated in the war with the Tsar. Historically, Shami had neither allies nor resources. But now that Franz has given the Tsar a gift that will make the latter sleepy and sleepless, it is no longer clear who will win. Chapter 596 Unexpected Reinforcement. Russia, St. Petersburg. Alexander was originally uneasy about the news of his father's return. After all, in the days when Nicholas I left, he had not done anything serious, except making a few women pregnant. In particular, His Majesty the Tsar was furious as soon as he came back, which frightened the prince even more. Fortunately, Nicholas I was quickly attracted by other things, and went to deal with urgent government affairs. Alexander's attitude towards Nicholas I was one of respect and fear, and he had a bit of hatred for the throne. He has been told since childhood. On that day the residents of the capital rejoiced when Tsarevich Cyrigula Pavlovich received the ancestral crown. This is a very long day that everyone is looking forward to, but an unfortunate incident occurred that day, and the tranquility of St. Petersburg was interrupted for several hours, while the new Tsar was everywhere receiving the sincere love and allegiance of the people. A handful of the most shameless villains appeared in the Senate Square. That was all Alexander was told. No uprising, no shooting, no cannon, no cannonballs. It was just an accident caused by ruffians, not a rebellion by the guards. That's all. But as the children grew up, the cruel truth was still revealed to Alexander. It was difficult for him to accept that the idol he admired was actually a liar, an executioner, and a bloody butcher who ascended to the throne by stepping on the bones. Finally one day, Alexander shot and killed a noble young man who accused the Tsar in public. But when he woke up, Duke Liu of the 3rd Department told him it was just an accident and then let him don't take it to heart. From then on, Alexander began to escape reality and became cynical, hoping to eat all kinds of things and die before the age of 30. He even claimed many times that he would give up the right to inherit the throne. Nicholas I had a deep sense of destiny towards Alexander. The former felt that the latter must be his successor, so he was extremely strict and at the same time extremely tolerant of him. From the age of 7, Alexander began to receive training as the heir to the throne. At the same time, he had to study history, Russian, mathematics, physics, philosophy, geography, French, English, German, Polish, law, speech, painting, music, gymnastics, swimming, fencing, horse riding, dance, military, civil engineering. Nearly 50 courses. No matter how ridiculous things Alexander did, Nicholas I chose to be tolerant, whether it was stuffing gunpowder into our horses, or trying to build an ice road from St. Petersburg to Moscow. But at this time, Nicholas I was not in the mood to care about what stupid things Alexander had done, because what happened in the Caucasus was too serious that Tsar had to admit that Shami was an outstanding military strategist and a formidable opponent. The two sides had fought dozens of wars in the past 10 years, and the latter almost maintained a complete victory record. Although Shamir only lost once or twice, his family was almost wiped out. The last sister had to commit suicide in a river in order not to hinder him, and his eldest son was even used as a hostage in Russia. Russia had not been injured in dozens of previous battles, but this time Nicholas I broke through. In less than a month, the Russian army lost nearly 20,000 people. 12 senior Russian officers were publicly executed, and countless Russian civilians were slaughtered and captured. In fact, one of the capitals for the confrontation between Chechens and Russia was the smuggling of white Russian slaves and selling them to other Xianfang religious countries, such as Ottoman and Prussia, or the further distant Khiva Khanate. In the world of Xianfang sect, raising white slaves is a very honorable thing, so the wealthy people are willing to spend money, and the Chechens naturally work harder with these weapons obtained from Austria, coupled with the funds obtained from selling white slaves. Shami was very confident that he could fight Russia. In fact, Shami took the initiative to contact Megid, but in the eyes of the latter, the former was just a lowly bandit leader. Especially his lowly background reminded the former of the last person who said he wanted to help Osman Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, Egyptian Pasha, the instigator of the two Turkish-Egyptian wars, and the culprit of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Shamir also contacted Muhammad Shah Qajar, the Qajar dynasty that ruled Persia, but the latter not only executed Shamir's envoys, but also informed the Russians due to differences in beliefs with the former. However, Shami did not give up asking the Arab world for help. But what came to help him was a group of unexpected guys, the Karamanli family occupying Tripoli and the mysterious owner behind it. Shamir only received the envoy of the Karamanli family with a try attitude, but he received unexpected and powerful assistance. Through the latter's accurate intelligence, the former achieved successive victories, especially this risky attack on the port, which doubled Shamir's strength. But he is not a fool. The Karamanli family and his master must have a bigger intention if they are willing to help him like this. But Shami felt that he had become the overlord at this time and did not seem to need those debts. Nicholas I was very angry about the performance of the Russian army. He cared more about the arms than the loss of soldiers, which were worth tens of millions of rubles. His Majesty the Tsar is still very obsessed with the bargains he bought from Austria. After all, the same goods cost double the price from the British, and the Austrian goods are not only cheaper, but also come with free shipping. For the sake of Russia, his own face, and those arms, Nicholas I made a shocking decision. He would use 200,000 Russian troops to level the Caucasus as for Albania's northern mountains. The Tsar was really not interested in taking care of such a nook and cranny, mainly because he did not have the time and energy, because civil strife was like a dagger always spinning around in Russia's belly. If the Chechens grow bigger, they can threaten Siberia in the east, threaten the agricultural areas near the Black Sea in the south, and possibly join forces with the Cossacks in the west, and even threaten Moscow. Although Nicholas I himself was very anxious. Russia was so big that it would take several months for its troops to be assembled, and winter would come in a few months, and supplies would become a problem by then. Therefore, at least from 1845 to 1846, Russia could no longer conduct any large-scale military operations. If the war did not go smoothly, the Caucasus War might last for several years, and the cost to the country would be staggering. In fact, if there is a choice, that Franz is unwilling to do such a thing. After all, in theory, Austria still needs to rely on the power of Russia as an ally. But he also doesn't like to leave the choice of destiny in other people's hands, even if it's something that originally happened in history. For this reason, Franz needed to ensure that Russia did not take advantage of the situation to rob the Austrian Empire and continue to invade the Ottoman Empire in a short period of time. Chapter 597 sent troops to Albania, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz listened to Archbishop Prussia bragging about his achievements every day in his study. Austria's dispatch of troops to Albania, packaged by the church, became a holy war to liberate Christians from the hands of the pagans. Of course, this is not without its benefits. For example, the bill did not encounter many obstacles when it was passed. Even Count Karlarov did not like this kind of war with little gain, and Prince Metternich opposed the continued weakening of the Ottomans, but he had to give in due to the strong public opinion of the church. Of course, this does not mean that the church has the ability to kidnap the country. In fact, the person who proposed this plan was Franz himself, so everything went so smoothly. In addition to the church, the military or the Josephites also played a certain role. After all, the expansion to the Balkans can be said to be a continuation of Joseph's strategy. Although the directions are different, they can be regarded as reaching the same goal. In the eyes of Admiral Friedrich, there was another interpretation. If the Austrian Empire wanted to become a naval power, it must control the Strait of Otranto or capture Genoa. Otherwise, no matter how powerful the navy is, it can only continue to be its little overlord in the Adriatic Sea. In the eyes of the great powers, it will always be a fleet kept in a bathtub. At this point, Russia and Austria are very much like one trying to break out of the Black Sea and the other trying to break out of the Adriatic Sea. Personally, I think this metaphor can make everyone understand the importance of controlling the Strait of Otranto. However, Friedrich wanted to directly capture the entire Albania. After all, the experience he gained from many battles with colonial countries was that non-powerful countries were simply vulnerable. Whether in Africa, West Asia, or Southeast Asia, Friedrich was confident of defeating enemies several times. His own point: although Britain overturned on the island of Kalimantan, he felt that Britain was not a land power and that fighting deep into the interior would lead to failure. Moreover, whether the British Indian Army could be regarded as a European army was still a question. The Austrian Empire is a traditional land power and is better at land warfare. Capturing the seamen of Otranto and turning the Adriatic Sea into Austria's inland sea was very attractive to Admiral Friedrich. Of course, Austria can also choose to continue expanding westward and conquer Sardinia, or let it cede the Genoa region, which can also break the blockade. But Genoa's location is too close to France, and it is not a very suitable choice. After all, no country will put its most important fleet in an insecure place. However, the opposition of Count Korolov and Prince Metternich was not unreasonable, because every Austrian military operation in the Balkans required a mobilization of a large amount of manpower and material resources. He didn't understand at all that in an area with a population of only a few 100,000, it was necessary to mobilize an army of 100,000 people. Moreover, expansion in the Balkans costs more than in the colonies. What's more terrible is that the feedback from those bad places to the empire is minimal. The tax revenue of the two provinces of West Bosnia and Montenegro is not as much as the city of Venice. At this time, the mountainous area in northern Albania proposed by Archduke Franz was undoubtedly a bad land among bad lands. The Ottomans conquered it and could not develop anything of value for hundreds of years. Then there is the issue of pagan and alien populations. The religious and ethnic issues within the Austrian Empire have reached the point where everyone can see it. It is really not a wise move to continue to increase this kind of population that can easily cause conflicts. Prince Metternich analyzed the international situation Ottoman was used as a bargaining chip to restrict Russia, both to prevent Russia from advancing westward and to win over Russia. However, the war in Albania at this time is undoubtedly a challenge to Russia's hegemony in the Balkans. You must know that the Tsar has always regarded himself as the guardian of the Orthodox Christians. In addition, this kind of behavior also challenges the bottom line of the British, because the British want to dominate the Near East and want to use Ottoman to contain European countries, so they have been maintaining the integrity of the latter. In fact, France had his own considerations. The British had let off a lot of harsh words, but let's see if France should go to North Africa to colonize, or go to North Africa and not only captured Algeria, but also invaded Morocco. As for the British, it seems that we have to find ways to win over it to prevent Russia from further expansion. As for the issue of Russia and Count Korolev, it has been explained before, and I won't go into details here. Let's talk about Friedrich's strategic issue. In fact, in terms of future development, although Italy has many ports, there are very few that can be used as military ports. With the development of the times, the tonnage of ships will become larger and larger, the power and range of artillery will become stronger and stronger, and the requirements for military ports will become higher and higher. According to later history, the most suitable military port in Italy is Taranto, which is the anchorage of Italy's aircraft carrier battle group. However, at this time, Taranto was still in the hands of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. The other one was La Spezia, but its defense was still far behind the former, and it was in the hands of the Kingdom of Sardinia. The remaining ports are Gaeta, Livorno, La Maddalena in Sardinia and Augusta in Sicily. However, these ports have their own problems. Either they have no barrier protection or the ports are too shallow to accommodate them. There are not many warships, and one common problem is that they are not in Austrian hands. On the other hand, both the Austrian ports of Venice and Trieste have solid defenses at this time, and as long as they control the Strait of Otranto, they are almost invincible. Even if the opponent has an aircraft carrier in the early stage, it will be difficult to pose an effective threat to it. Early carrier-based aircraft were not suitable for long-range bombing. Instead, they were mostly torpedo attack aircraft. They posed a great threat to ships, but bombing land targets and ports felt like seeking a dead end. Early carrier-based aircraft were characterized by short range and small bomb load. The Austrian army moved quickly, mainly by sea, to reach Sankini, and at the same time, encircled the mountains of northern Albania through Montenegro and western Bosnia on the way. It is said that it is an encirclement, but in fact, more often it is used to persuade people to surrender. The northern mountains of Albania were overwhelmingly Catholic and encountered little resistance. Of course, some people chose to resist and even took the initiative to attack the Austrian army. Therefore, these people are no longer the objects of salvation, but heretics who should be expelled and heretics eliminated. As for who is a heretic and who is a heretic, this is naturally decided by the Austrian side. Those families and organizations that resisted were quickly disintegrated. After all, no matter how powerful the guerrillas were, they could not compete with the leading party all over the mountains and plains. The initial occupation was extremely smooth. This was not because the Austrian Empire was really successful in the Balkans, but because the Ottoman Empire and the local noble lords were really inappropriate. People in most areas welcomed the Austrian army, but there were a few areas that resisted, and some even wanted to return to the arms of the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 598 The British Counterattack. London, England. Damn it. What did that fool in Aberdeen do? Prime Minister Robert Peel couldn't help but get furious. He felt a little incredible about what was happening. How did France and Austria come together? What is that idiot Major doing again? Canning said, Your Majesty Prime Minister, the top priority is that we must break up the alliance between France and Austria. Robert Peel. Damn. That alliance with its own ulterior motives never existed. Just like our alliance with the Russians, it was just a cover-up for others to see. The latter statement revealed the essence of the relationship between the two alliances, but it made the cabinet members even more confused. Why is the Prime Minister so angry over a non-existent alliance? In fact, although Robert Peel felt that Britain and Russia could not become allies, he did not mind using the influence of this incident to further weaken Russia, and at the same time, create an invincible image for Britain to obtain a more flexible diplomacy position. However, the Europeans seem to have overreacted to this incident. Not only did the UK not gain any advantage in this incident, but it also lost its national image and even cut off another possible road. In addition, Osman seems to have become a frightened bird. The frightened bird is easy to fly around, and even has a relationship with the Austrians. The reason why Britain is so wary of Russia is because the latter borders the Ottoman Empire. Although Austria is not as aggressive as Russia, it is also bordered by the Ottoman Empire. It has an inherent advantage in the competition for the inheritance of the Near East. At this time, the Duke of Haddington, who was the Lord of the Admiralty, came up with another hypothesis that raised Robert Peel's blood pressure. Your Majesty, Prime Minister, I think the Austrians may be drunkards who don't care about wine. Pack sacks, drive donkeys, German proverb, but it seems even more inappropriate to use it here. The phrase drunkard's intention is not in the wine, is a Western proverb, or it may be in Latin, French or the like. Of course, someone with a hand can help replace it with a Western proverb with a similar meaning. Damn it. Sir Duke, please speak frankly. The British Empire is facing challenges, and I'm not in the mood to listen to your literary verses. Your Majesty Prime Minister, please look at Albania's position. As he spoke, Duke Haddington unfolded a Mediterranean chart, pointed directly at the mouth of the Adriatic Sea, and then continued, Your Majesty Prime Minister, this is the Strait of Otranto. It is the choke point of Austria's maritime power. As long as we block it, the Austrian Navy will only be a fish in the pond for us to catch. Although Robert Peel did not understand military affairs, he still knew something about some important straits. The reason why Britain dared to bully the Austrian Empire unscrupulously was because it could not pose a threat to the former. Your Majesty, Prime Minister, Austria's coastline once only reached Dalmatia, but now they lease Sanguinary from the Ottoman Empire, and their coastline has advanced to 170 kilometers away from the Strait of Otranto. It's hard to say whether the Austrians have any further plans. If they control the Strait of Otranto, they can escape the Adriatic Sea. This undoubtedly adds another strong opponent to the British Empire. At this time, Colonial Secretary William Gladstone made a disdainful snort. TSK, your navy gets sky-high remuneration every year, but doesn't want to work. Sanguinary is 170 kilometers away from the Strait of Otranto. Even if they build forts on both sides of the Strait of Otranto, do you know how wide the Strait of Otranto is? 74 kilometers. Have you heard of artillery with a range of 37 kilometers? Or do you think the Austrians intend to fence off the 74-kilometer long strait with wooden barrels? Since ancient times, only warships have been able to perform maritime blockade missions. Even if the Austrians occupied the entire Albania, would the Mediterranean fleet stationed on Crete be free of charge? The wooden barrel refers to the mine, and here the Army is humiliating the Navy, because during the American Revolutionary War, many Royal Navy battleships were blown up by Americans with wooden mines, but the Army's troop transports were unharmed every time. Later, someone discovered that the reason why the Navy was blown up by mines was because the Navy had the habit of picking up floating objects on the sea, while the Army was often busy vomiting at sea at this time, and would not pay attention to those unknown objects. William Gladstone's words are not unreasonable. After all, the range of conventional artillery at this time is less than 1 kilometer, and it is simply impossible to block the 74-kilometer long strait. As for the so-called barrels, they actually refer to mines, but the mine tactics of this period were not mature. It was too difficult to block 74 kilometers of sea with mines, and it would waste a lot of money. In addition, when the Whigs were in power, the Navy told the cabinet that it could control the entire Mediterranean as long as it garrisoned troops in Crete. But now, when the Tories were in power, the Navy's armada was actually afraid of the Austrians rushing out of the Adriatic Sea. This contrast outraged both William Gladstone and Robert Peel. My Lord England expects that every man will do his duty. Nelson's famous quote, "If the Navy cannot fulfill its mission, I think you should look for the problem within yourself instead of shirking responsibility or wasting the precious financial resources of the British Empire." Robert Peel's words were very harsh, but as a naval admiral, he couldn't refute them. Your Majesty Prime Minister, I ask you to think again. Due to our country's global strategy, the strength of the Royal Navy has been stretched. Now we can cope with France and the United States, but if Austria and Russia both go to sea, the consequences will be unimaginable. William Gladstone once again interrupted at an inappropriate time. Now that the Strait of Gibraltar is still in our hands, your navy can't even hold a single strait, right? As long as there is Gibraltar's Western Fleet in France, or the Ottomans, Austrians, or Russia, they will not be able to escape the fate of being dominated by us. You just need to keep your responsibilities, you short-sighted fool. What if one day the French attack Gibraltar from land? The Duke of Hiddington roared intolerable, but William Gladstone did not show weakness. That has nothing to do with Albania. You just want our army to die. Shut up. Robert Peel had to stop him. He had had enough of his subordinates' cleverness. Although he was good at economics and politics, his understanding of military affairs was very limited, and he had to rely on these people. This made Robert Peel even more irritated. Fortunately, Cunning, the Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, said at this time, in fact, we don't need to punish Austria or the Ottoman Empire. How do you say this? Isn't the Austrian Empire preparing to manage the mountainous areas in northern Albania for the Ottoman Empire? We can use the same excuse to control the southern plains. Now that the ranking has dropped again, please give me some monthly votes or recommendations. Chapter 599. Welcome to the Balkans. On June 14, 1845, the British used the same excuse to lease most of southern Albania to the Ottoman Empire. However, due to the tragic experience in Afghanistan, the former did not intend to go deep into the interior to fight with the Albanian army. At the same time, because they had to pay an escrow fee of 1 million Ottoman liras to the Ottoman Empire. The British had already planned to plunder the Albanian plains. The deal between the British and the Ottoman Empire spread immediately in Europe. Seeing that the former continued its blockade policy against the Austrian Empire, France, Prussia, and Russia all breathed a sigh of relief, and even Majid became more at ease. This time the British are in direct contact with the Austrians. Regardless of whether the two will clash with each other, internal friction in Albania is inevitable. But there are also countries that are dissatisfied with this, and this is the British little brother, the Kingdom of Greece. The King of Greece at this time was Otto I, who was elected as the first king of the Kingdom of Greece in 1832. Although the king was escorted to the throne by 3,500 Bavarian soldiers and the navies of Britain, France, and Russia. But he had extraordinary ambitions. At that time, Otto was crowned King of Greece, not King of the Greek people, which meant that millions of Greeks were still under Turkish rule. This king wanted to change the status quo, and the ambition he showed to the Greeks was also called the Great Ideal of the Greeks. The Great Ideal, irredentism, was the Greek dream of restoring the Byzantine Empire. There were 2.5 million Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks in Constantinople, Thessaloniki and Smyrna demanded unification. These places were also the centers of Greek merchant activities. Crete was always preparing for an uprising. At that time, there were a large number of Greeks living in southern Albania, and Otto I took it for granted that this was also Greek territory. Thanks to Otto I's long-term practice, that seemingly outrageous Great Ideal actually became the national ideal of the Greeks even after Otto I was deposed. His great ideals were still affecting the nation. The British behavior at this time undoubtedly slapped Otto I hard in the face and deeply hurt the national feelings of the Greeks. Fall out with a British guy in front of him? It is not possible for a country that has just been independent for more than 10 years, but it is still possible to secretly provide some support to the local Greek armed forces. Otto I was born into the Wurtebach family, the royal family of Bavaria. Although he was required not to merge with the Kingdom of Bavaria, this did not prevent him from visiting relatives. The Wurtebach family is prosperous, and naturally there are many good relatives who have both strength and financial resources, as well as compassion. For example, his aunt Madame Sophie and his cousin Franz. Since the weapons and equipment of the Austrian Empire were updated very quickly, a lot of knockout products would naturally be produced. These items were usually sent to the colonies or sold to countries in need such as Russia. But since they are relatives, we can half sell and half give them away, or even arrange payment in installments or something. So a small country with a population of only more than 800,000 actually asked Otto I to pull out a team of 40,000 people. Of course, these 40,000 people are not professional soldiers. Most of them are soldiers similar to the Tang dynasty. They are usually farmers and craftsmen, and they will only be drafted into the army during wars. At this time in history, the Greek military strength was only 8,000, including 3,000 Praetorians guarding the palace. The Greek government at that time was very poor, so it was necessary to sell some weapons to maintain fiscal balance. As a result, a large number of weapons from Greece suddenly appeared in the market in southern Albania. These weapons were cheaper than the standard weapons of the Ottoman Empire, and their performance was superior. The most important thing was that they appeared very timely. After all, the British and Austrians both claimed to suppress the rebellion and separatist forces on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan, and those rebels naturally could not sit still and wait to be killed. In fact, Austria's actions in the mountains of northern Albania were rapid and bloody. Although they tried their best to block the news, it was impossible for the Albanians in the south not to know about it. So, when the British arrived, what they found were abandoned manors and heavily guarded fortresses. Of course, the fortress that the Albanians thought was strong was no different from a house made of biscuits in the face of British firepower. As a result, the British began to loot everywhere as usual, and the forts were easily pried open by the new artillery. But this also strengthened the determination of the locals to resist. After all, the Greeks in the eastern mountains did not want to share their land with others, and the Albanians could only choose to stay in the plains and continue fighting with the British. Fortunately, the number of British troops was not large, so they could not occupy too many places. In fact, the British had no plan to occupy the entire Albania. They just wanted to prevent the Austrians from rushing out of the Strait of Otranto. There are less than 3,000 British troops scattered in large and small cities and ports, and the smallest outposts even have only a few British troops, which gives the Albanian rebels an opportunity to take advantage of. The latter could mobilize a large number of troops in a short period of time to besiege a small group of British troops. This method of tactics made the British very unhappy. But without sending out a small force, there was no way to collect taxes. Without taxes, there was no way to pay the 1 million Ottoman liras in custody fees, and there were not enough funds to maintain the occupation. Due to the disagreement between Colonial and War Secretary William Gladstone and Admiralty Lord Hiddington, Prime Minister Robert Peel finally decided to leave the matter to the Navy. After all, southern Albania was not a British colony in name. Although the Marine Corps was well equipped to deal with the Albanians, it was not good at maintaining order in the occupied areas. In fact, the British also want to use the old method used in other places, that is, to support a puppet regime. It's just that this trick doesn't seem to work well in Albania. That is, the puppet regime's rebellion speed is faster than their surrender speed. Some guerrillas even took the initiative to surrender, and then took the opportunity to attack the British team that came to accept the surrender. And the most terrible thing is that the British soon discovered that the weapons used by the guerrillas were no worse than them. And when the enemy is in darkness and we are in the clear, the former will obviously suffer greater losses. To be honest, France still admires the British's courage to take the initiative to go through minefields. After all, the Balkans are notoriously vicious. Of course, the British even dared to invade Afghanistan 3 times, and now the invasion of the Balkans seems to be a routine operation. France knew very well that the British could not send too many troops to Albania, a remote country, because they would not be able to make ends meet. However, if the number of troops sent is too small, and it is impossible to establish a stable order locally, it will fall into an endless security war. Therefore, the Balkan problem is almost unsolvable for the United Kingdom. Chapter 600 Rubik's Cube. Austria's reaction to the British's entry into Albania was extremely cold. In fact, not everyone had the same mentality as Franz, or understood the power of the Balkans. Rather, the vast majority of people at the top of the empire felt that the northern mountainous areas of Albania were insignificant, and the British occupation of the south was even more meaningless. Friedrich dismissed the British troops deployed in southern Albania. 3,000 men and a dozen small boats of less than 1,000 tons had no impact on the Austrian Imperial Navy at this time point. In fact, Friedrich and his eldest brother, Archduke Albrecht, studied the possibility of attacking Albania on land. The latter told the former responsibly that 3,000 people could not stop the Austrian army. At this time, Austria could mobilize tens of thousands of troops in the northern Balkans at any time point. If the naturalization of the north is completed, the number of troops that can be mobilized will increase exponentially. Once the railway construction is completed, it will not be a problem to deliver 100,000 troops and supplies to Albania within 1 to 2 weeks. It's just that the construction of railways in the mountains will be more troublesome, but fortunately Austria itself is a mountainous country and has accumulated a lot of experience. Long before this, the Austrian Empire was the most adept at building railways in mountainous areas in the world at this time, and there was no other country in the world. Of course, Friedrich still knew how to show weakness to the enemy. After all, he was no longer a child. Over the years, he has accumulated a lot of experience in the wars in the north and south, and Friedrich knew exactly how to make the other party relax their vigilance. All large battleships of the Austrian Navy must stay away from British ports, and British ships must slow down immediately if they are discovered. The military observers sent to Durs by the Duke of Hiddington believed that their trip was unnecessary because the Austrians' construction method of large battleships was extremely unreasonable, or they could not build ships at all. Durs was Albania's largest port at this time. British military observers believe that the Austrians may regard building battleships as building houses, thinking that the taller and bigger the better, but in fact those bulky structures hinder the original performance of the ships. After all, there is an upper limit to wooden structures. After a large number of reports were sent back to Britain, Duke Haddington even began to wonder whether Austria simply wanted to expand in the Balkans and at the same time was afraid of Russia, so it adopted this pick and seek strategy. If that is the case, then the behavior of the British Navy at this time is a complete waste. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Mozart's music has been echoing in the teaching hall. This is not because the family is a fan of Mozart, but because Franz hopes to use the Mozart effect to improve the IQ of the family as much as possible. Most of Mozart's works are pure, fresh, bright, with stable rhythm, and conform to the unique physiological laws of the human body. This characteristic can stimulate positive emotions such as joy and pleasure, which in turn can promote the improvement of cognitive processing levels. This is the so-called Mozart effect. In fact, for the sake of the family's intelligence, Franz can be said to have been very worried about it. He made detailed plans from food, music, books to read, knowledge to learn, and even toys for this purpose. Franz even built a toy factory to produce products including 9-ring rings, puzzles, building blocks, traditional building blocks and Lego blocks, and Rubik's cubes. It's just that when the Rubik's Cube was first produced, it stumped a large number of experts and scholars from the Royal Academy of Sciences in Vienna. At first everyone thought it was a toy of Archduke Franz, and no one took it seriously until a professor gave one of the replicas to his child. As a result, his son, who was called a genius since he was a child, could not restore it after 4 hours. Finally, the professor decided to try it himself. Although the professor majored in chemical engineering, he was very confident in his intelligence. However, he failed to recover it after another 4 hours. However, for the sake of his dignity as an old father, he could not give up. As a result, the professor played with the Rubik's Cube all night and failed to solve it. In the end, he had to ask for help from his colleagues, a group of people known as the smartest people in the entire Austrian Empire. Then a group of professors began to try one by one. Of course, since there was only one Rubik's Cube, everyone had a limited time to try. As a result, they spent a day and failed to successfully restore it. So Liebig thought this was a joke. It must be a joke by Archduke Franz. Then Liebig asked Archduke Franz at the following regular meeting of the Royal Scientific Society of Vienna, "Archduke Franz, will this toy of yours never be restored?" "No." Franz's answer was very straightforward. Liebig asked very reluctantly, "Can anyone restore it?" At this time, Some colleagues began to pull this giant of the chemical world, carefully reminding him to pay attention to his words and identity. Franz, of course. I believe that a small toy like the Rubik's Cube is nothing to people like you, Liebig. I can't do it, Franz. How is that possible, Liebig? Said angrily, not only me, but all the professors in our School of Chemical Engineering can't do it. At this time Babbage stood up and said very seriously, Mr. Liebig, please pay attention to your attitude. Franz waved his hand, signaling not to offend the peace. In fact, even scientists are not all straight men. They only know that doing science does not care about the world. In fact, some people are quite sophisticated, such as Babbage and some scientists who were born as civilians. After all, they have tasted the warmth and coldness of the world. It is completely reasonable for some people to deliberately flatter Franz, but it does not mean that those who do not want to flatter Franz cannot be used. On the contrary, Franz appreciates this attitude very much, but he still has to help correct these people when they make mistakes. Please, give me the Rubik's Cube, soon. The Rubik's Cube was handed over to Franz. He looked at the Rubik's Cube in his hand and took a deep breath. Then everyone saw the various layers of the Rubik's Cube rotating rapidly in Franz's hands. 28 seconds. Franz threw the restored Rubik's Cube to Liebig. Looking at the completely restored Rubik's Cube in his hand, Liebig couldn't help but murmured with a long mouth, what kind of magic is this? It's not magic. There are rules to this toy. You should find some mathematicians to figure this out. They should be better at it. However, there are specialties in the art industry, so you don't have to be discouraged. Franz had seen the teachings of later generations and had played with it for several years when he was young, so the third level Rubik's Cube was not too difficult for him. However, Franz didn't intend to lie about it. After all, this thing itself had rules. It was only a matter of time before they discovered it, not to mention that the lie would be exposed sooner or later. But Liebig was still a little reluctant to believe what he saw, so he disrupted the Rubik's Cube and returned it to Archduke Franz. Can you do it again? Franz was a little helpless, but the Rubik's Cube started turning rapidly again. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.